caves are often formed as water carves its way through limestone over a long period of time. This same thing actually occurs in ice and even in the largest chunks of ice floating around on Earth. But despite their similarities, ice caves and limestone caves possess some distinct and challenging differences. World-renowned cave diver Jill Heineth was diving in a cave on the largest iceberg on Earth in Antarctica when something went horrifyingly wrong. Was filled with an innate desire to explore and the perfect storm of inspiration. Because she grew up in the 60s, she was a live spectator of the incredible Apollo missions that would eventually put humans on the moon. This would inspire her to want to become an astronaut, but unfortunately her mom had to break the news to her that there was no Canadian space program, at least not at the time. Thankfully, this wasn't her only source of inspiration and spent every week anxiously waiting for the Sunday night airing of Jacques Cousteau's undersea adventures. Her natural inclination to explore would only be strengthened throughout school because of some influential teachers, and later she would join the Girl Guides of Canada, where there were many strong woman mentors who showed her that it was okay for girls to be adventurous and be in non-traditional gender roles. Later on, she received a Bachelor in Visual Communication Design from York University and then went on to start her own graphic design and advertising company. Then in the evenings and on weekends she taught scuba diving classes, which she had become very proficient at. But, despite the success of her business, what she truly wanted was more time in the water. And so in 1991, she sold her business and moved to the Cayman Islands where she worked at a small diving lodge and handled the marketing, dive instruction, and day-to-day operations. She would also spend this time getting really good at photography in and out of the water, and then about 1,000 dives later she moved again, this time to Florida, to focus on cave diving. Throughout this time as well, she faced several challenges as a woman in a very male-dominated sport. This is the case for not only diving, but especially cave diving and later on underwater cinematography. She was frequently the only woman on the expedition boat or the training class, and she was frequently passed over for opportunities unless she was very assertive about her desire for a specific role. In fact, at one point she hoped to become a commercial diver and she was told bluntly that there was no room for women in commercial diving. This should have been discouraging, but instead of being discouraged, Jill put her head down and worked hard and became undeniably good, and forced her way into the niche regardless of the challenges. In Florida, she started working with filmmaker Wes Shiles, who became a mentor to her and would go on to contract her to write and produce several independent films. During this time as well, the two of them worked with National Geographic, and then in the late 90s the two of them talked about wanting to go to Antarctica. They knew that National Geographic was also interested in doing a story there, but they needed to find a compelling topic. Then, serendipitously, as they brainstormed ideas, a chunk of ice broke away from the Ross Ice Shelf. And this wasn't any chunk of ice. This was the largest iceberg ever recorded, later named the B-15 iceberg, and it absolutely can't be overstated just how significant this was. An ice shelf is a large floating glacier that extends from the coastal landmass. As with most glaciers, they slowly flow downward under the weight of their own mass, and in Antarctica and other areas where these glaciers form on the coast, the ice flows down and into the water. Once these sheets are massive enough, the connection point can crack and eventually break off and become an iceberg. It also can't be overstated just how massive these ice shelves are. They can range from just 300 feet thick to as much as 3,000 feet. The Ross Ice Shelf also has an area of 193,000 square miles, which is roughly the same size as France. And the B-15 iceberg that broke off of it was 4,200 square miles, which is the same size as Jamaica or 10 times the size of New York City. When it broke off, it became the largest moving object on the planet. Incredibly, this wasn't entirely unexpected. Scientists had been monitoring the cracks forming in the ice shelf and figured that it was only a matter of time before it broke away entirely. When this happened, Jill hypothesized that much like soft limestone, flowing water would be carving out crevasses, tunnels, and caves in the ice. And although she wasn't entirely sure that this was the case, she and West pitched the idea to National Geographic, who thought it was a fantastic idea, and then they got the funding they needed to mount an expedition. Then in 2001 they left New Zealand and sailed for 12 days across horrendous 60-foot seas to reach the section of the iceberg they intended to explore. When they got to the edge, Jill was stunned to see that it looked like a mountain floating in the ocean, because in some places it's thousands of feet of pristine ice cliffs rising from the water. Once they picked what they thought was a suitable spot, they hopped in a smaller Zodiac boat and launched from the main ship for better maneuverability. Eventually they pulled into a small bay that would lead them into the frozen ocean, and Jill realized she was nervous. Less so for herself and more so for Wes and her husband Paul, who would be coming with her, even though they were each great divers. Her longtime dive partner Wes Skiles founded the film company Cars Productions in 1985 to expand his underwater film career and always advocated for cave divers to use their skills to aid in scientific diving projects. Throughout his career he worked on over 100 films that he filmed, directed, and produced, and was an expert under the water. Her husband Paul was a pioneer in diver education and held several positions in several different prestigious diving associations. He's also a master instructor and has held records for depth and caves at various times. However, despite each of their credentials, they lacked experience in ice diving, unlike Jill, and this would be the coldest dive either of them had ever done. This inexperience would prove to be a problem right from the first dive. As soon as they rolled off of the boat and into the water, Wes's suit filled with water. Despite this, he decided to tough it out for just a minute to test out their new camera. But in such cold water, which is just fractions of a degree above freezing, you almost immediately lose motor function and quickly lose the ability to think clearly. After that minute of footage, sitting in what was essentially just a bag of ice water, it took Jill, Paul, and several other crew members all helping to pull Wes into the boat. Then they had to rush him back to the main ship and get him into a sleeping bag immediately to warm him up. And this was just the first minute of the first dive. In addition to this, although they were all highly experienced limestone cave divers, the ice cave that they intended to dive into, if it existed, was uncharted territory. For example, instead of being able to tie lines to the rock, they would need to use titanium ice screws anchored into the ice to tie into. Following that first test dive, Jill and Paul decided to head back into the water to see if Jill's prediction was correct. They got into the water once again with a mixture of nervousness and excitement and immediately got an almost brain freeze-like sensation. Because of how cold the water was. Although they were wearing wetsuits and almost entirely covered from head to toe, they opted for a slightly less restrictive face mask to be able to see better. From the surface, they descended through the slush and chunks of ice and mixing of salt and fresh water. Then they entered a large crevasse in the iceberg and followed it down as the light slowly faded behind them. This crevasse would eventually take them all the way down to the ocean floor at 130 feet. They looked around for a little bit. And then miraculously, just as Jill theorized, there was a passage. This passage was a cave directly underneath the massive iceberg. The two of them slowly swam into the icy cavern and were amazed to see that the seafloor was teeming with life. Above them was the deep blue and white ice of the iceberg, and lining the floor was red, yellow, and orange filter-feeding organisms that Jill described as looking almost like a shag carpet. As they moved deeper into the cave, all of a sudden, all of these spider-lobster-looking ice apods started raining down on them from the cracks above. About the size of the palm of a hand, they landed all over the two divers and their camera equipment. After shaking them off after that uncomfortable experience, the pair moved deeper into the dark blue cave. The ice around them and above them constantly groaned, making clicking and popping noises against the seafloor. And now more than ever, they were acutely aware of the fact that unlike a limestone cave, not only was the ice moving, but it was rapidly changing. At one point there was a deep groaning vibration that went through Jill's entire body. She looked over at Paul, and he clearly had felt it too, and although it was unsettling, looking around it seemed as though everything was okay, so they decided to keep exploring. It wasn't until later on their way back that they realized that everything was not okay. There were massive chunks of ice blocking the passage out of the cave. The doorway was gone. The noise they had heard earlier was acts of the sound of ice breaking apart and blocking their exit. But without any other options, they waded up to the chunks of ice, and thankfully they were able to squeeze their way past and back out into the crevice. At about 20 feet of depth, they had to stop to decompress, and Jill could see Wes and one of the crew high-fiving and celebrating. Jill and Paul would later learn that the two of them had watched as a giant piece of iceberg broke off and landed directly in the path of the doorway. The wave it caused was actually so big that it almost capsized the boat, and they had no idea whether or not Jill and Paul would be able to make it out again. They also had no way to mount a rescue, so they just waited anxiously, hoping to eventually see the pair in the water. The following day, Jill, being the consummate professional that she is, was optimistic about getting back in the water. Although there were some challenges, she figured at the very least they knew more than they did the day before, giving them better odds. It was still risky and uncharted territory, but at least it wasn't their first dive anymore. She and Paul dropped down into the water once again and quickly made their way to the cave entrance. The opening seemed relatively stable, and so they proceeded in. Started taking pictures of the cave and the sea life. On this second trip, Jill noticed that there was a small current moving through the cave that she hadn't noticed on their first dive. Little by little, this current got stronger and stronger, and then out of nowhere, the water was rushing through the cave very quickly. Instinctively, she dug her hand into the seafloor to stop herself from being pushed forward, and the current caused her body to spin around her hand. What they would later figure out is that the iceberg melted throughout the day, and all of this meltwater flows down and through the cave, creating a current. And with how strong it was, they knew they needed to leave immediately because it could get much stronger and suck them somewhere deep inside the iceberg. But as they turned toward the exit and started kicking, the current was already so strong that they weren't moving at all. They kicked and kicked but made zero progress. Quickly looking around for another solution, they saw a faint blue light off in the distance, which meant that there might be another entrance. They looked at each other and then decided to go for it and then let the current take them. They drifted for a long while, and seemed like the light wasn't getting any bigger because of how far away it was. But after drifting for what felt like forever, they did reach the light, and thankfully it was another exit. After heading back up to the surface, and once Jill finally got her head out of the water, she realized that all of the chunks of ice were so high that she couldn't see the boat. They had traveled far enough underneath the iceberg, and their vision was so obscured that they couldn't see the boat and the boat couldn't see them. Her stomach sank as she realized that they were lost in an ice field, and if they weren't found soon they would freeze to death. Not sure how much time had passed, she sat there shaking, waiting for some sign, and then she heard a sound. The same current that swept them through the cave also knocked the ship's anchor loose. When the crew pulled it up to reset it, it made a loud noise, and then the boat moved around a little bit. As that happened, Jill saw the slightest glimmer of the hull and called out to them. She was so incredibly relieved to hear Wes call back, and then shortly after that they were picked up. Following that close call, the team decided to make one final dive. Wes was so impressed by the footage he wanted to come down with them and use the best camera he had. They were already there, they might as well get the most out of their trip. So all three of them got ready and dropped at the ocean once again. This time Jill had just the smallest leak in her glove, allowing icy water to flow in, but decided it wasn't bad enough to warrant getting back out. Before long they were on the ocean floor and in the cave getting pictures. But once again the current picked up very quickly, and this time it was even stronger than before. Jill turned to Wes and Paul and gave them the signal that meant it was time to go, but again as they headed to the exit the current was already so strong they were barely making any progress. They used their hands to dig their way along the ground, but even that was barely enough to keep them moving. They pulled and pulled until their arms burned and shook, and Jill starts to think that they might not make it out again. She was in the front leading, Paul was in behind her, and Wes was in the back, and he was losing ground. He yelled to the others for help with the camera, and Jill thought to herself, screw the camera, we might die down here. Then when Paul dropped back to help, Jill was furious. That was the type of mistake that put everyone in danger. Thankfully, between the two of them, they did manage to pull it out of the cave and into the crevasse. But even though they made it into the crevasse, the current was so strong from all of the meltwater rushing down that it forced them down onto the seafloor and trapped them at 130 feet deep under the ocean's surface. Jill looked up at the slick walls of the crevasse and desperately looked for anything to grab onto. Now in the water for over 2 hours, Jill's hand was almost completely frozen because of the leak, and her hand slid right off the wall as she grasped for anything. Then she had an idea. She remembered seeing these tiny fish that burrowed their way into the ice and created holes about the size of a thumb. She ran her hand along the ice again and realized she could jam her fingers into the burrow to use as a climbing hold. Soon, all three of them slowly inched their way up 130 feet of ice out of the crevasse and back up to the surface. Almost 3 hours later, they emerged from the ice and Jill's hand was gray and lifeless. When she reached up to grab the ladder, it wouldn't even close around the handle, but they would successfully make it out and her hand would recover without issue. Incredibly, 2 hours later, the team had their equipment laid out once again, hoping to make one final dive. They just couldn't pass up on the opportunity to get more footage while they were there. They might be the last people to ever get this opportunity. But then as they sat there eating and planning out the next dive, they heard screaming from the watch up on the deck. All three of them ran up to see what the commotion was and watched in horror as the iceberg they had just been inside was breaking apart, rolling around, and bobbing up and down violently. Even the chunks of ice falling off of it were sending massive waves towards the boat. At that moment they all realized that had they been in the water, they probably wouldn't have made it out again. And just like that, they were the first and last people to ever see underneath that iceberg. Thankfully, they did manage to capture tons of footage from inside the cave that was later turned into a documentary known as Ice Island. Unfortunately, it's been several years since it aired and I couldn't find it anywhere online. If any of you are able to locate it, if you wouldn't mind commenting it down below, I'd love to see it. I'm sure many others would as well. I'm sure the footage is unbelievable. As for Jill, as I mentioned earlier, she faced several challenges as a woman in the diving world. But despite that, she is now regarded as one of the world's best divers, male or female. In 2018, she was awarded with the Beneath the Sea Diver of the Year Education Award, and then in 2020, she was inducted into the International Scuba Diving Hall of Fame. She's also won numerous other awards for diving, filmmaking, and writing, and is still active in all three pursuits. To this day, she considers the B-15 iceberg to be the highlight of her career. Donald Cerrone was diving through Aralito Cave in Cozumel, Mexico when something went horrifyingly wrong. Donald Cerrone was born in Denver, Colorado on March 29, 1983. Growing up, Donald was considered a bit of a troubled child. As a teenager, he took up street fighting and this would result in him often ending up spending the night in jail. When Donald was 16, his parents had enough of his behavior and the fighting and sent him to live with his grandmother. His grandmother welcomed him with open arms and would even bail him out of jail after some of his street fights. The next morning after she would bail him out, she would never bring up what happened the night before. She would simply say, "You know what you did," and then leave it at that. At the age of 20, Donald started kickboxing and then Muay Thai after that, and as it turned out, he was pretty good. After winning a few kickboxing competitions, he decided to pursue a career in MMA, also known as mixed martial arts, where he adopted the nickname Donald Cowboy Cerrone for his tendency to wear cowboy hats. He would win his first 9 fights in a row and was soon contending for championship fights in the WC. After leaving the WC, Donald signed with the insanely popular fight promotion company The Ultimate Fighting Championship, also known as the UFC. As a fighter in the UFC, Donald rose to superstardom and became one of the largest drawing fighters in the promotion's history. In addition to fighting on the world stage and the largest fight promotion in the world, Donald is a bit of an adrenaline junkie, as are many of the individuals in that community. In his spare time outside of training and competing in the UFC, he competes and participates in all sorts of other high adrenaline pursuits like dirt biking, off-road racing, water skiing, and even bull riding. Another thing Donald really loves to do is scuba dive. After getting his certification in high school, he fell in love with all things diving. In his own words, he just loves diving, he loves shipwreck diving, he just loves everything about it. However, his favorite is cave diving. In August of 2018, Donald Cerrone was in Cozumel, Mexico, where he planned to go diving with a friend of his who we'll call Alex. The first 3 or 4 days of their trip they went diving to some shipwrecks and to some coral reefs with a few other friends of theirs. They also planned a slightly more serious dive for just the two of them at a cave known as Aralito Cave. In the old South Harbor of Cozumel, in an area known as Caleta, there is an unremarkable looking pond that is easy to get to and easy to access. Most divers and tourists pass by this pond and think nothing of it. However, this pond is actually very remarkable. In fact, it is actually named Cenote Aralito de Paraiso. A cenote is a natural pit or sinkhole that forms when the limestone underneath the surface collapses, revealing the groundwater underneath. Many of these cenotes actually lead to subterranean water bodies that can range from just small pools to massive and expansive cave systems. Cenote Aerolito is unremarkable on the surface, but leads to one of these massive and expansive cave systems and connects to over 6 kilometers of mapped caves that exist below the surface of Cozumel. On August 17th, Donald kissed his wife and new baby goodbye before he was leaving to go meet up with Alex. Before he left, his wife told him that she was really uncomfortable with him going caving with Alex. The reason she was uncomfortable was that she was worried about Alex's capabilities as a diver. For many years, Alex and Donald had been caving together, and Alex was even sort of a mentor to Donald. But Alex was now getting older, and his motor skills had declined with age. His mind was still as sharp as ever, but his body just couldn't keep up. Donald reassured his wife that everything was going to be fine, and that he was going to come home after the dive, just like always. His wife was still worried though, and so as an extra precaution and to reassure her, Donald ordered an extra cylinder of air. Originally, he had planned to take 2 cylinders for the dive, and so now he would have 3 for their dive. As is typical in cave diving, they would be diving in thirds. This means that they were going to use a third of their air going in, a third coming out, and then they would have a third in reserve in case something unexpected happened. In cave diving as well, the first divers who discover and map out a cave will run long ropes called guidelines throughout the cave to help divers find their way in and out of the caves. This is because many of these caves are massive and winding, low-visibility corridors that are just difficult to tell apart, making it easy to get lost if you're not familiar with the system. These guidelines are also marked with directional signals, known as cookies, that are clear and easy to read and point towards the exit of the cave. One of the leading causes of death in cave diving is when the guidelines are improperly used or improperly marked by the divers as they navigate the cave. These guidelines typically come in 2 different varieties. First are the fixed or main lines that are permanently installed in the cave system and eliminate the need for divers to install a large portion of the lines in a cave each time they dive. These can either start right at the exit or a bit into the cave to ensure that recreational divers don't find them and then enter the cave without proper training or equipment. Main lines are also not all connected, requiring that divers bring reels with them to connect from one to the other using lines known as jump lines. Jump lines are attached by divers as they move through a cave to connect from one main line to the next. Jump lines are also removed by divers as they exit a cave to help simplify the lines within the system. Donald and Alex entered Erlito Cave from the little unassuming pond on the surface. They then traveled along the various lines of the cave to explore the gorgeous and expansive system they had come to see. At some point, they needed to transition from one line to another. Alex went first and grabbed his light and hung it around his neck so that he could make the switch with 2 hands. As Alex went to tie off, his buoyancy device, which is a little device that fills with air to increase or decrease your buoyancy, got loose and shot up to the ceiling of the cave. He then kicked his feet, spun around, and when he did that, the guideline, their lifeline, wrapped itself around him. Donald immediately swam over to Alex to help him try to untangle the line, but Alex started panicking. He then started thrashing violently, spinning around, hitting the walls of the cave, and kicking up all of the silt from the bottom of the cave. Silt is the dust and sediment that sits at the bottom of the cave, and when it gets kicked up in the small spaces inside of a cave, it brings the visibility to almost zero. It's like swimming around in mist so thick that you can barely see the hand in front of your face. An Erlito cave was now completely silted out. Knowing how dangerous this situation was, Donald took a few big steps backward away from Alex so he didn't get caught in the line either and so he could regain visibility. Within arm's reach of the main line now, Donald watched helplessly as Alex thrashed around even more. One of the unspoken rules of cave diving according to Donald is that you only worry about yourself in a panicked situation. The idea is that the panicked person poses a threat to anyone trying to help and there's no reason for 2 people to die if one person can still make it out. As he sat there holding the main line, he looked towards the exit of the cave and knew that he was safe if he went that way. He knew where the exit was, he could easily swim to it and be sure that he would get out alive. He also looked at the completely silted out section where Alex was and knew that Alex would almost certainly die without help. In the panic, Alex had somehow turned off his light and Donald just sat there thinking that he hopes that he also didn't drop his mouthpiece and that he wasn't drowning to death just a few feet away from him. Donald decided to break one of his unspoken rules and decided to go into the silt to try to save Alex. As soon as he entered the silt, he lost all sense of direction. He didn't know which way was up or down, and then he started to panic as well. All of a sudden, he was taking deep, fast, panic breaths, completely freaking out, more panicked than he's ever been in his entire life. In his panic, he smashed his head off of the ceiling of the cave and then closed his eyes. The hit to the head gave him a brief second of calm, and then he managed to tell himself to slow his breathing down. With his breathing slowed, barely able to see the hands in front of his face, he looked at his glowing watches that indicated his depth and time. He then checked the 2 pressure gauges on each of the cylinders he was using and knew that he had a third one that was completely full, still unopened. He then closed his eyes and sat there in the pitch-black, silted-out room, trying to think through the panic and figure out a plan. The first thing he did was try to feel around the silt and try to find Alex, but Alex was nowhere to be found. Thankfully, he had calmed himself down a little bit more and then decided to start moving his hands along the wall of the cave to see if he could figure out where he was. Typically in good visibility, divers will make a mental note of the different landmarks in the cave so they can find their way out. But the channel that they were in was one that they were on their way to explore. They weren't coming out of it, so it was entirely unfamiliar to him. He then decided to check his compass, because when they came into the cave he had measured the direction of the exit from the first jump to be 126 degrees. This was a bit of a long shot because in the winding tunnels of a cave, you can be facing the correct direction towards the exit, but if you're not in the right section of the cave, that direction might just lead to the wall of tunnel. Without any other choice, he tried to swim in that direction, but immediately came up on a wall. He then tried to swim lower and went right into another wall, and now he was right back in full panic mode. So now he's kicking and thrashing and freaking out and swimming violently, and then all of a sudden, he exited the silt and stumbled on the main line. Donald grabbed it and tried to calm himself down once again, but there was a new problem. He was on the wrong side of the silted section of the main line. Behind him, deeper into the cave, was silt-free and clear. The way out of the cave, the way that he needed to go, was completely silted out still, and the exit was almost 1,000 yards away. In addition, there was a jump in between where he was and where he needed to be, meaning that he would have to find his way untethered through the silt to make it out of the cave. He sat there for a moment, thinking about the maps of the cave that he had scoured before they entered that day. He knew that up ahead there was a split in the cave, one side went to the exit and the other went deeper in the cave. He re-entered the silt and started to feel around and managed to find a hole. Not sure if this was correct or not, he kept on going and came up on another hole. He felt around and thought that it felt familiar and decided to swim into it. But then he noticed that he was swimming against the current. When they had come into the cave, he also noticed that they were swimming against a small current. Meaning that given that he was now traveling in the opposite direction, he was swimming in the wrong direction. Beginning to panic once again, he frantically swam back to the main line on the opposite side of the silt. Sitting there literally hyperventilating from panic, all he could think of that morning was when he kissed his wife and baby and assured them that he was coming home. So he swam back into the dark abyss of silt once again and panicked once again. And now in the pitch-black darkness of the cave, he thought to himself, all of this heavy breathing is sucking all of the air out of my tanks. So in addition to being lost in the darkness, he started to worry about running out of air entirely. Trying to calm himself, he looked at his watch and then his gauges and then back at his watch. And managed to figure out that he had roughly an hour left of air. He started to think about what would happen once he ran out of air. On the air-only system he was using, once he ran out, the mouthpiece would just fill with water, and then he would inhale the water and he would drown. Ironically enough, one of Donald's biggest fears is drowning. So, not wanting to drown, he grabbed his buoyancy device and began breathing into it to fill it up completely. With it full, he shot up to the ceiling of the cave and was now resting upside down. At first, he sat there thinking about his wife and daughter and thought about grabbing his grease pen and notepad to write a letter to them about how he had messed up and how sore he was. Then he thought about how terrified he was of drowning and decided that once he ran out of air, he would breathe from his buoyancy device until there was no more oxygen left in it. Once it was only expelled carbon dioxide, he would keep breathing until he slowly passed out, at which point he wouldn't be awake when he drowned. As he sat there thinking about writing the goodbye note and how he intended on just going to sleep in the darkness, he was infuriated with himself that he was giving up hope and succumbing to the situation. He thought to himself, "I'm a fighter, that's not what fighters do," and so he began crawling along the ceiling of the cave upside down. This time he remembered that there was a large crack that ran the length of the cave on the ceiling. In his panic, he frantically crawled along the ceiling, breathing hard, hyperventilating, and then all of a sudden, he found it. So he latched onto the crack, crawled along it, and then it started to widen, and then there was light off in the distance. He could see the green glow of light filtering into the cave. So Donald swam frantically to the glow, all the while still panicking, still hyperventilating, and when he reached the opening, his tanks got stuck and they wouldn't go through. And so he was kicking and thrashing and freaking out, but he managed to fall the crack some more, and then his tanks went through, and then there was the opening of the cave. He made it. Upon making it out, the relief was just unbelievable. One second he was writing a goodbye note to his wife and kid, and the next he was going home to see them. As he left the water, he saw that Alex was just sitting there. As it turned out, Alex managed to somehow grab the main line in his panic and just followed it out of the cave. The two of them looked at each other, and Alex said to Donald, "So, we're not diving together anymore, are we?" And Donald would answer back, "Nope, that was it." Donald then grabbed his phone, texted his wife, and said, "Bit of a scary moment today, but I'm coming home." In 1991, a group of the best cave divers in the entire world planned a series of expeditions in Indian Springs Cave in Florida. On the first dive of these expeditions, a horrifying event occurred that is so rare that it has still yet to reoccur in the 30 years since the incident. In Florida, there is an area known as the Woodville Karst Plain that stretches from Tallahassee, Florida into the Gulf of Mexico. This 400 square mile area is known as a karst landscape and is made up of limestone and other soluble rocks. The soft limestone easily dissolves in water, so rainwater and other flowing water slowly erode the rock over time. As a result of this erosion, karst landscapes are often littered with caves, underground streams and sinkholes under the surface, and steep rocky cliffs above ground. In fact, the Woodville Karst Plain is home to the largest underwater cave system in the entire United States. One of the surface connections into this expansive cave system is an unremarkable-looking pond known as Indian Springs. Located in Wakulla County, Indian Springs leads down into the Indian Springs cave system that's at least 300 feet deep and at least 2 miles long. In 1991, as part of the Woodville Karst Plains project, a dive was planned in November that would be conducted by this team of what was at the time the most organized, sophisticated, and accomplished group of cave divers on Earth. They had already set a bunch of records for depth in a cave and time spent underwater. And this was going to be the first in a series of dives in the cave to explore some potential leads. These dives had already been planned for almost 2 years at this point, and they had even developed special decompression tables because of the extreme depth of the area that they were going to be exploring. Joining the support team was experienced diver George Irvine. This was going to be his 77th cave dive and near his 1000th technical dive, but despite all of that experience, he was still somewhat scared of cave diving. Every time he surfaced and saw sunlight again, he was overwhelmed with relief for having made it out again. And this was going to be his first dive with the team of any significance. The system had been down for months, and so this first expedition would serve to get the rust off of all the team members. One of the two exploration leads, Parker Turner, had assigned everyone some task, even if it was just something contrived, just to get everyone involved. There would be 3 teams in the water that would actually enter the cave. The first team would place 1 set of gas bottles. The second team, consisting of George and another diver, was going to place a second set of bottles for the traverse. And Bill Gavin to complete the exploration. Bill had been part of the initial exploration that had discovered the leads in the first place, and any remaining crew would act as support from the surface. For the type of dive that they were doing, known as technical diving, they were going to need 2 types of gas mixtures. On the traverse, they would use a mixture of nitrogen and oxygen, and then they would switch to a trimix of oxygen, helium, and nitrogen on the deepest section to mitigate nitrogen narcosis. This is a phenomenon that occurs when certain gases in regular air have a narcotic effect at high pressures. On November 17th, the teams arrived at Indian Springs and prepared to enter the water. The spring itself is a little pond in a clearing surrounded by trees. There's a boardwalk that goes down to the waterside, and there's even a little dock floating in the middle of the spring. Team 1 dipped below the pond's surface and then made their way to the bottom and then to the cave entrance. Team 2 went next and made the same descent. And finally, Parker and Bill entered the water for the longest and most challenging dive of the three groups. Teams 1 and 2 would place all of the equipment first, and then Bill and Parker would be on their way in as the other teams were leaving. The traverse to the area where the leads were found was about 40 minutes, then they would spend around 25 minutes exploring at 300 feet, then another 40 minutes to leave again. From the pond floor there is a cavern that eventually turns into Indian Springs Cave. This cavern leads into a tunnel that extends for a couple hundred feet until an area known as Squaw's Restriction. The cave narrows here to a point that just a single diver and their equipment can get through at once. After that, it opens up once again to a series of winding tunnels that are made of rough yellow and white limestone. Thankfully, because of how popular the cave is, there are permanent lines fixed almost the entire length. These lines help to guide divers even in poor visibility. Bill and Parker made the long traverse through the winding tunnels until they made it successfully to a massive room known as the Wakula Room. They spent the allotted time searching around. And then at around 63 minutes, they started to make the traverse back. Unbeknownst to them, a rare and horrifying event was occurring that is one of the only like it to have ever occurred in diving history. On the way back, they picked up their nitrox bottles, and Bill checked that he had plenty of gas left in the tanks on his back. As they were doing this, Parker signaled that his underwater scooter was running slowly, so Bill tethered the two of them together and then pulled both of them using his scooter. They were only about 1,500 feet from the entrance now, so it didn't matter that this would use up his battery. Eventually, they reached a distinctive arrow marker on the line about 500 feet from the entrance. On the way in, Bill estimated that the point that they would reach that marker would be about 105 minutes into the dive, so they were perfectly on schedule. Then they made the left turn following the marker and noticed that visibility had decreased. Although they had been pretty careful on the way in, they might have still kicked up some silt, so it wasn't anything to worry about. They continued on and saw that the floor was now completely obscured by a billowing cloud of silt. Thankfully, the line ran along the ceiling, and that was clear, but as they continued, visibility just kept getting worse and worse. Eventually, they had to stop using the scooter and switch to hold in line because of how bad visibility was. When they got to the area where Squaw's Restriction should have been, the line just disappeared into the sand. They started pulling on the line to pull it up out of the sand, but eventually it went so deep that they couldn't even pull it out. Right where Squaw's Restriction was, there was tons of sand, and visibility was less than a foot. Bill heard Parker shout asking what this was, and then the two of them backed up and removed their stage bottles and scooters. The stage bottles were just about empty at that point anyway, so they switched back to the tanks on their back. Whatever this was, it seemed like it was going to take a long time to figure out. In that section of the cave, there were two fixed lines, so the first thing they did was check the one they weren't on, but it also led directly into the sand. This made no sense, they had just come through here. A little while earlier, about 5 minutes after George and his partner passed through Squaw's Restriction, the water came rushing past them and the cave bottom turned into a sandstorm. George thought that his scooter had somehow turned on and was bouncing around bumping into things, but in reality, the decompressing divers were creating bubbles that floated up and changed the buoyancy of the rocks on the ceiling. The momentarily heavier rocks then broke away from the ceiling and plummeted down and caused a mudslide directly into the path of Squaw's Restriction, completely covering it up. By the time Bill and Parker returned, there was no longer a way out of Indian Springs. On the other side of Squaw's Restriction, Bill attached his reel to the main line and started to search around for the way out. From what he could see, although he didn't know how, it seemed to be blocked with sand and rock. But with visibility so bad he couldn't tell what had happened or if he was even in the right place. He eventually noticed a light flow of water, so he followed that for a bit. But after searching some more, he doubted that they were actually at squaw's restriction. Maybe they had made some sort of mistake on their way out. While Parker continued to search, Bill swam back out about 300 feet back to find the arrow again. He just stared at it, trying to ensure he hadn't misread it or made some silly mistake. When he was absolutely sure he was right, he swam back into the sill and back to Parker, and the two of them spent the next 45 minutes desperately trying to find a way out of the sand, burning through their gas tanks the entire time. Bill and Parker eventually checked their pressure gauges and realized that they were getting very low on gas. Parker grabbed his piece of slate and wrote, "What do we do on it?" and then handed it to Bill. Parker obviously hoped that the more experienced Bill had some idea, but Bill had no clue either. The only thing he could think to write was, "Hold on, I'll go look," and then he tied his reel to the main line and started a sweeping search again. Again, he found nothing, so he went back, but even though he was gone for less than 5 minutes, Parker was nowhere to be found. Bill grabbed his stage bottle and breathed from it for a little bit, using that time to think of a plan. Once the stage bottle was empty, all he'd have left is a few minutes of air in the tanks on his back. After 4 minutes, the stage bottle was out. Parker still wasn't back, and he was just minutes from drowning. He frantically searched again, and this time found a line attached to the main line. In his panic, he didn't understand how it got there, but he followed it anyway. Then there was a small opening in the restriction. And it was the second stage of a regulator, which, again, in his state, he didn't quite register exactly what that meant. He freed the regulator and then saw a line ascending almost straight up and out of the restriction. Then, almost completely out of air, he raced up to the next set of bottles 100 feet up. Just as he was about to run out of air, he reached the next set of bottles, basically on a breath hold. But, despite making it to the bottles, there was no relief. Parker was not there. These were the same bottles that Parker should have been using also. It was at that moment that Bill realized Parker had drowned. He realized that the regulator he found was Parker's, the line that he followed was Parker's, and in the poor visibility, Parker's body was probably floating around somewhere in the silt. So he just sat there waiting for support divers to find him. Up on the surface, just after the cave-in, the pieces that broke loose and the sand that was displaced caused the water from the spring to rush in and fill the space. As the water was flowing to fill the new area, the water level was actually observed by the surface crew to drop by a foot or so. Then suddenly it stopped lowering as squaw's restriction got blocked up with sand. The water flow had also pushed all of the silt to the other side of the restriction shortly before it was blocked. This meant that George and the other divers were in perfectly clear water all of a sudden. Still with no idea what happened, George was confused to find that his scooter was in the same place he left it. Now you'd think that this would be concerning for the surface team to see all of the water all of a sudden drop like it did, but this is actually not uncommon. On the water flowing within them, the outflows are often not known, and sometimes, for whatever reason, water flows more quickly out of them, causing the water level to drop. There are even a few recorded occurrences of entire lakes disappearing entirely, only to reappear later. Lake Jackson, for example, in Florida as well, drains entirely for years at a time. But then George and his partner eventually noticed the silt was returning once again, and now they were starting to get really uncomfortable with the weirdness of the whole thing. The team above had already gotten out, but they were still about 20 feet below the surface. George decided that he should go down again and briefly check things out. He swam down to about 110 feet and everything seemed to be fine from what he could see. He checked out the bottles and saw that they were still fine, but from how deep he was, he couldn't actually see the now completely remodeled squaw's restriction. The silt that he was seeing was actually the result of the restriction reopening and all of the silt from the other side filtering back over. Thinking that everything was okay, he returned to the surface and he and his partner finally went up and out of the water, but his partner looked completely freaked out. He just seemed to have a bad feeling about the whole incident. He asked George if he had seen either of them, and George replied no, but the bottles were still there, so everything should be okay. Then another one of the support divers popped his head out of the water and was asked if everything was okay and if he had confirmed visual contact of the pair. He confirmed that he saw Bill, and his partner confirmed that he had seen Parker and that Parker had even waved at him. The support diver then said, "That wasn't Parker, that was me waving at you." Upon hearing this, George's partner immediately turned to him and said, "Something isn't right here, I'm going back down to check," and then dove back into the water. About 2 minutes later, he resurfaced and told George that he had found Parker's tanks hanging on the line and that he and Bill were not with the tanks. They both went down after that and tied into the line because visibility was still almost zero in that section. Then they started searching in the murky water, desperately hoping to find Parker and Bill. It was too late. At some point George ran into someone and realized that it was Bill and he wasn't moving. Then he noticed he was breathing, so he checked his pressure gauges to ensure he had gas, but Bill just sat there, not acknowledging George. Eventually, he pulled out his slate and passed it to him, and George realized why Bill was acting so weird. On it said, "Parker is dead." George's heart dropped when he read the message. He just sat there for a second, staring at the slate, not registering the full meaning of the words. When he snapped back into it, he realized that Bill was probably in some state of shock. He needed to ensure that he had enough to breathe for however long he'd need to decompress. He tried to communicate this to Bill, but he was clearly out of it. He couldn't get him to move, and Bill didn't seem to care if he even had enough gas to keep himself alive. Eventually, George tied a reel to where Bill was and swam to the surface to tell the others. When he surfaced, he tied to the dock and got himself together before finally saying to the others, "Parker is dead." He was barely even able to get out the words. He exclaimed to the others that someone had to go down and get him because he wasn't moving. He told them where he was and to follow his line, and within seconds another diver had his tanks on and was getting back into the water. They eventually moved him from where he was to a better spot where he had to stay and decompress for 4 hours because of the additional time he had spent at depth. Over that time, Bill was filled in with as much information as they could give him about what they knew, but for a while, he had no idea how much of the cave had collapsed or if anyone else was missing. Thankfully, he would exit the water without physical damage from decompression sickness because they hadn't actually been quite as deep as they expected while exploring. In the meantime, George tied back into the main line and started desperately sweeping the cave, looking for his friend's body in the silt. After 9 passes, he eventually ran out of gas before finding any trace of Parker. When he exited the water, he even forgot to decompress and got minor decompression sickness as a result. By the time he finally exited, cops and dozens of other people were swarming the area. Among the crowd were other cave divers familiar to the team, suggesting that Parker may have found an air pocket or something along the cave roof. George tragically reassured them that the depth where he ran out of air would have made this impossible. The team explained to police that they didn't have enough gas to make any more attempts that day and said they would have to return the following day after resupplying. 2 men from the group drove to Parker's house and broke the news to his wife, while the others returned to the individual who owned the compressor to refill the gas tanks. Bill's van was parked outside the house, and that's where he sat all night, collecting himself. The following morning, he emerged from the van and rejoined the group back at Indian Springs, where he laid out the plan to clear the restriction and then bring Parker out safely. But the police arrived shortly after and told the divers that they had already entered the water at 6 a.m. and retrieved the body. Ironically, it was Parker who had taught the local police how to conduct dives and how to do body recoveries. The friends he had made during that time teaching them didn't want to leave him in the water any longer. After analyzing the incident countless times, the divers think they've figured out the sequence of events. Around the time Bill felt the flow of water, Parker must have felt it as well. Parker, unlike Bill, had actually found the source of the flow, which was a small hole in the restriction. Almost completely out of air, Parker decided to take his tanks off and squeeze through. He tied his safety spool into the main line and then dragging his tanks forced himself through the opening. After making it to the other side, he unfortunately ran out of gas and passed out around 30 feet from the decompression tanks. When he passed out, he dropped his tanks, they landed on the line down below, and then he floated to the ceiling because of the positive buoyancy of his wetsuit. It seems that by forcing himself through, he cleared the restriction even more, allowing Bill to squeeze himself through with his tanks just a few minutes later. Parker's tanks had also landed on the line, positioning it directly outside of the hole, giving Bill a perfect guide up and out to the decompression tanks. Had it not been there, Bill isn't sure that he would have made it. A delay of even a single minute meant that he might have drowned as well. As of a paper published in 2015, this is the only known cave dive death that was due to natural causes rather than human error. The effect of decompressing divers on the surrounding cave system is now a widely known phenomenon because of this incident. Unfortunately, it just wasn't well known then. Following the events of November 17, 1991, many of the divers from the team stopped cave diving. Together. George and Bill took some time off, and George almost stopped entirely as well. Eventually, they slowly returned to diving once again, and at some point George invited Bill down to Mexico to do some cave diving. In a film about the Woodville Karst Plains project, Bill would later say, "A day has not passed that I have not thought about." John Jones was exploring the famously tight Nutty Putty Cave in Utah when he got stuck upside down in a tunnel the size of a dryer door. Because of the angle he was stuck, blood began to pool in his brain, ensuring that he would die if he wasn't rescued soon. John Edward Jones was born into a big family of 7 kids. As a kid, John and his brother Josh were introduced to spelunking or cave exploring by their father. During their childhood, they would go on caving expeditions all over their home state of Utah, where they learned to love exploring the dark underground tunnels. At 26 years old, John was now married and had a 1-year-old daughter. His wife was also pregnant with another child, and they were now living in Virginia, where he was attending medical school to become a pediatric cardiologist. That year for Thanksgiving, John went back home to spend time with his family, and they all decided it would be fun to explore the famous Nutty Putty Cave to celebrate and connect over the holiday. On November 24, 2009 at around 8 p.m., John and 10 other friends and family squeezed through the tight opening of Nutty Putty Cave. First explored in 1960 by caver Dale Green, Nutty Putty Cave is located 55 miles south of Salt Lake City, Utah. At its peak, Nutty Putty attracted 25,000 visitors a year and was famous for its narrow, slippery tunnels and particularly tight squeezes. Formed by hydrothermal vents shaping their way through the limestone, Nutty Putty Cave is named after the putty-like brown clay that lines its walls. Hydrothermal caves like Nutty Putty are characterized by a series of large domes connected by narrow, and the different sections of Nutty Putty have names appropriate for their size, such as the Birth Canal, the Aorta, the Maze, and the Scout Eater. In total, Nutty Putty was surveyed to be 1,355 feet long and 145 feet deep underground. Nutty Putty Cave also has a bit of a tumultuous history. Due to its popularity, there had been excessive smoothing of the limestone rocks in the cave, and it was predicted that a fatality would occur in one of those sections. In fact, in 2004, 5 years before John Jones would enter the cave, 2 Boy Scouts nearly died in 2 separate incidents within a week of each other. In one of those cases, it took rescue crews 14 hours to rescue a 16-year-old scout from the cave using a complex system of pulleys. Following this incident, the cave was closed to visitors and wasn't reopened again until May of 2009. A gate was also installed at the entrance, and visitors would need to book ahead of time to ensure that there was only a single group entering the cave at once. Upon entering the cave, the group explored the largest room of the cave known as the Big Slide. After that, John, his brother Josh, and 2 friends decided to try to find a more challenging section they had heard of called the Birth Canal. The Birth Canal is a narrow squeeze that drops down and opens up into a larger room and looks as though you're being birthed as you come out of it, hence the name. John found a hole in the wall that he thought led to the Birth Canal and went in head first. He crawled along his stomach for some time and didn't see anywhere that the tunnel opened up any further. In fact, it narrowed as he crawled along. Now, it's not entirely clear exactly where John was in the cave at this point. Some sources think that he had correctly entered the Birth Canal, but then accidentally turned down another section known as Scout Eater, whereas other sources claim that he was in a tunnel beside the Birth Canal named Ed's Push. In either case, these tunnels don't lead anywhere large enough for a person and are unexplored as a result. Eventually, he came upon a sharp downturn in the tunnel that went nearly straight down. Maybe thinking that this was the drop that he was looking for in the Birth Canal, John inched his way down the tunnel that measured only 10 inches by 18 inches across. Before long, John realized he had made a huge mistake and the tunnel didn't open up at all. It narrowed even further and he was now stuck upside down. The first person to find John was his brother Josh, and when Josh got to his brother he tried pulling him up and out of the tunnel but was only able to move him just a little bit before John slipped out of his hands and slid right back into the crevice. When John slipped back in, he got wedged even further into the crevice, and this time, one of his hands was pinned underneath him and the other was forced backward. The only thing sticking out of the crevice now were just John's feet and ankles. Realizing the severity of the situation, John and Josh said a quick prayer, and then Josh hurried out of the cave to get help. The first rescuer to arrive was a woman named Susie Motola, and by the time she got to John at 12:30 a.m., John had been trapped for 3 hours, 400 feet into the cave and 100 feet underground. Susie introduced herself to John's black running shoes that were the only thing visible in the tunnel, and John responded by saying, "Hi Susie, thanks for coming, but I really want to get out of here." Over the next few hours, dozens and dozens of rescuers arrived and worked to free John from the cave. They brainstormed different plans to free him and even discussed lubing up the walls of the cave to slide him out. Eventually they decided on a series of climbing cams. A rope would then be fed through the cams and attached to John's legs, and the rescuers would then pull on the other end of the rope and pull John up. As they attached the cams, they also began drilling away at the chunks of rock to widen up the tunnel. Unfortunately, due to how narrow the passages were, the drilling was slow and it would take over an hour for just a couple of inches of rock to be removed. Another thing complicating the rescue was the position of John's body. The ceiling above where John was stuck was so low that they couldn't just pull him straight up. They would need to pull him up a little bit and then readjust, and then pull some more and then readjust some more. The first attempt using just the climbing cams was unsuccessful, and so rescuers decided instead to feed the rope through pulleys that were bolted to the walls of the cave. Again, this was a painfully slow process because of how narrow the cave was, and although a team of almost 100 rescuers worked frantically to get John out of Nutty Putty Cave, only a single person was able to access John at a time. Meanwhile, 19 hours into the rescue, John's condition was beginning to worsen. The human body is adapted to pumping blood into the brain against the force of gravity when we're upright. When we're upside down, blood pools in the brain and the heart is unable to work hard enough to pump blood out of the brain. This also causes the heart to work much harder as it tries to continuously pump blood out of the brain against the force of gravity. Eventually, the strain on the heart and the pooling in the brain is fatal. As time went by, John started to have difficulty breathing and was alternating back and forth between being calm and being panicked. Around this time as well, a two-way radio was brought into the cave and lowered down to John so John and his wife could talk to each other. Although they were both worried, they tried to comfort each other as best as they could. Finally, rescuers finished drilling the holes and attaching the pulleys into the walls of the cave. 8 men then grabbed one end of the rope and began inching John out of the crevice. After so much time spent upside down, John's legs were in a lot of pain, and so the team had to stop frequently to give him breaks. But eventually, they did actually manage to pull him up high enough for one of the rescuers to make eye contact with him. He looked tired, his eyes were red, and he complained about the pain in his legs, but would actually smile at rescuers. After one final rest, the rescuers pulled John up once again, and he was almost out when all of a sudden the entire team fell backwards as the rope went loose in their hands. The closest rescuers knocked unconscious when one of the pulleys broke free from the wall of the cave. When he came to, there was too much dust in the tunnel for him to see anything. When the dust settled, he saw the large piece of rock that had rope tied around it had broken, causing the pulley to break free. At the same time, he realized that John had slid right back into the crevice. This time it seemed as though he was even deeper than before. The rescuer had also suffered severe facial injuries from the impact and had to have someone come in and take his place. When the new rescuer arrived, he noticed that John's breathing was much more shallow and less frequent as John was now struggling to stay alive. The new rescuer desperately tried to drill a new hole for the pulley, but after exhausting himself was replaced once again. Another new rescuer arrived and the next replacement tried to talk to John, but couldn't get any response. Shortly after that, a medical professional crawled into the cave to where John was, and John was pronounced dead at midnight on November 25, 2009. The official cause of death was ruled to be cardiac arrest. During the rescue, a total of 137 rescuers worked continuously for 27 hours but ultimately were unsuccessful in saving John Jones from the Nutty Putty Cave. The following day, authorities determined that retrieving the body would be too dangerous, and so cement was poured over the entrance, and John's body has remained there ever since. The man was diving in the Poganizia Bay cave when something went horrifyingly wrong. Off the coast of Croatia, in the Adriatic Sea, is a beautiful island known as the island of Sholta. The water surrounding the island is a bright turquoise that makes the island look like a tropical paradise. With a population of only 1,700 people, the coves around the island are perfect for swimming, fishing, and diving in the clear, warm water. There is, however, one area that the locals try to avoid, and that area is the Bay of Poganizia. In the native Croatian, the name Paganica suggests something evil, and under the bay's surface is a cave that is known simply as the Bay of Paganica Cave. In September of 2002, a group was sailing in the Adriatic Sea and stopped in the bay to do some diving. On the night of Tuesday, September 10th, after having dinner and drinks, some of the members of the group decided to get into the water at around 9 p.m. The remaining individuals on the boat included 3 members of the crew, the captain who was asleep in his cabin, and a man known only as MK. Originally from Germany, MK was a 31-year-old naturalized citizen of Croatia and worked as a cook, and around 15 minutes after the group left, MK decided that he wanted to go diving as well, so he entered the water at around 9:15 p.m. For his dive, he was using a 15-liter air cylinder pressurized to 200 bars, he was wearing a neoprene suit, and he had a dive computer on his wrist to give him all the necessary information for a nice safe dive. At the surface, the water in Paganizia Bay was a nice comfortable 24 degrees Celsius, and MK then slowly made his way down to 9 meters to the cave entrance. The cave's entrance is a 2-meter wide funnel shape that gradually widens down to the first corridor. At around 15 meters, there is a split in the corridor that separates the cave into 2 galleries, one shallow and one deep. Although not shown in the map, each of these galleries has a labyrinth of tunnels that snake their way through the chambers, making it very easy to get lost, and the cave's interior, as with most caves, is lined with a fine silt. This silt is composed of dust and sand and typically lines the floor of these underwater caves, and divers have to be very careful not to disturb the silt or it creates an opaque fog in the cave that brings visibility to essentially zero. Even with a high-power flashlight, the way that the particles scatter the light can make it difficult for divers to even see their hands a foot in front of their face. Upon reaching the split in the cave, MK decides to enter the deep gallery, which goes all the way down to 57 meters or around 200 feet. It also has at least one straight drop that allows you to go from 35 meters at the chamber's roof all the way to 50 meters in a straight line. Although MK was in good physical condition, his dive training was fairly basic and he was also fairly inexperienced as a diver. Despite this, he went straight for the drop-off and straight down to 50 meters in a smooth, dark descent. At the bottom of the pitch-black chamber, the temperature drops a whole 10 degrees to only 14 Celsius or 57 Fahrenheit. After reaching 50 meters, MK started to ascend right away, first back up to the chamber's roof, then into the corridor leading out, and then he made a crucial mistake. MK made a wrong turn. Instead of going towards the exit tunnel, he turned and went into the shallow gallery. According to divers who know this cave well, when ascending from the deep gallery, the shallow gallery entrance looks like the exit funnel, even in good visibility. In poor visibility, like in a silted-out cave, this mistake would be even easier to make. To make things worse, MK had a few drinks with dinner, impairing his judgment as he entered an entirely unfamiliar section of the cave. This was now around 25 minutes into his dive, and with the air he had brought, he only had 35 minutes of air to ascend to the surface. This would also need to include some decompression stops along the way, or else he would get severe decompression sickness from ascending too quickly. MK must have been horrified as he made his way through the labyrinth of tunnels looking for the exit. On the surface at 10.30, the rest of the group that had gone diving returned to the boat. Upon realizing that MK was missing, 2 of the divers went to the cave to search for him, and they searched for over an hour before returning to the boat at 11:41 p.m., but found no sign of MK anywhere. The group knew that unless MK had found an air pocket somewhere in the cave, based on the amount of air that he had taken, he would have already been completely out of air. So at 12:15 a.m. on Wednesday morning, they made an emergency call to the police in the nearby city of Split, Croatia. Later that morning, 2 police divers arrived and dove into the water to search the Paganica. First they swam to the entrance at 9 meters, then entered the dark tunnel. The cave widened for a bit until 15 meters when they reached the split between the 2 galleries. The police divers were also attached together by a line to prevent them from getting lost while searching, but at some point one of the divers let go of the line and disappeared into the darkness. After his partner was nowhere to be found, the other police diver frantically searched for a way out as he ran out of air, and just before he was completely out of air, he managed to find the exit funnel and escape the abyss. In his panic, and because of how low on air he was, he had to skip his decompression stops and developed severe decompression sickness as a result. And the police diver who had gotten lost would never be seen alive again. It's thought that he made the same mistake as MK and mistook the tunnel to the shallow gallery as the exit tunnel and then got lost in the labyrinth of tunnels. And although this was tragic, the search was still ongoing for MK. There were various sections in the cave where tiny fragments of light filtered through into the tunnels. And so it was conceivable that there was an air pocket that existed where MK could have found refuge. If he was still alive, this would mean that he would have been trapped for over 24 hours in the dark when divers re-entered the cave the following day to continue the search. The police diver who had gotten lost was found at 24 meters in the shallow gallery, and after searching the shallow gallery thoroughly, MK's body was still nowhere to be found. Divers then entered the deep gallery, and tragically, MK's body was found at 54 meters at the bottom of the cave. He was still in full gear. His diving mask was not on his head, his regular was out of his mouth, and he had a knife in his chest. While removing his gear, the knife was accidentally removed from his chest and his dive computer fell off, but they were recovered soon after and brought to the surface. Upon making this horrific discovery, the rescue had officially turned into a crime scene, and MK's death had to be treated as a possible homicide. So, all of the diving equipment and all of the dive computers from all the members of the party were collected for forensic investigation. In addition, there was a suspicious reddish stain that was found on the deck of the boat. Police swabbed the area and immediately sent it off for analysis. Next, blood samples were taken from the entire crew and several knives were collected from the boat. Police then administered polygraph tests to all of the crew and all of them passed except 2 of the crew who were on the boat when MK reportedly went diving. Before testing, they were unaware that MK had been found, and during the testing, the subjects reacted to the words knife and blood. After the tests, these 2 individuals were taken into custody, but no formal charges were made just yet. The rest of the party was released but forbidden to leave the country as the investigation continued, and while police waited for the stained analysis results, all of the scuba gear was analyzed. First, they needed to make sure everything was working correctly and hadn't been tampered with or sabotaged. The dive computers were tested in a hyperbaric chamber and pressurized to a simulated depth that would exceed the depth at the bottom of the deep gallery. Analysis afterwards showed that each of the computers displayed the same dive profile, indicating that it were in perfect working condition. And these profiles created by dive computers track the beginning of the dive, the maximum depth, the total decompression time, total ascent time, and total dive time. These can then be used to create a graphical representation of the dive. In addition, the computers had recorded 37 earlier dives, data that once stored cannot be deleted or changed, ensuring its accuracy. Next, the autopsy on MK's body found that he was in good physical condition before his death. He had a stab wound on the left side of his chest between his nipple and sternum, and the wound was 11 centimeters deep and punctured his aorta. His lungs were found to have water in them, indicating that he had breathed water sometime around that he had died, which is typical of drowning. This means that it was likely that he died within 2 minutes or less after being stabbed. His blood alcohol was also 0.114. For reference, the legal limit for driving is typically 0.08. Based on all this information and the signs of drowning, MK was either stabbed and then thrown immediately into the water or stabbed under the water. The police then explored several possibilities about the circumstances of his death. The first possibility was that MK got into a fight with one or more people for some unknown reason. MK could have then been stabbed on the boat and then thrown into the water where he lived for a few minutes. This would explain the signs of drowning around the same time he was stabbed. Now, to understand this next part, you need to understand what the graphical representation of the dive computer ended up revealing. First, it showed MK entering the water and heading down to the cave's entrance in one smooth descent. From there he traveled directly into the deep gallery and almost directly down to the 50-meter mark. After touching down, his dive computer registered him going up almost immediately once again. After this, the graph bounces up and down between the maximum depth of the shallow gallery and the ceiling of the shallow gallery, indicating that he was moving around within its tunnels, seemingly looking for a way out. At some point, after the random depth changes, he ascended deeper once again to around 40 m. He then rested at this depth for around 5 minutes before the graph shows a descent straight down to the bottom of the cave where his body was finally found. So if MK was stabbed on the boat and thrown in right away, his body would then need to be taken directly down to 50 m, then taken immediately back up and wandering through the shallower section, then back to the deep section where it dropped to the bottom of the cave. Technically speaking, the killer could have done this using MK's air, saving his own return, but what he wouldn't have been able to do was surface at 10:30 p.m. or earlier, as was corroborated by the other members of the party, unless he skipped his decompression stops and risked serious decompression sickness. Additionally, if MK had been stabbed in the boat, he wouldn't have been able to clear his ears or his sinuses, which is typical during a descent to avoid injury. During the autopsy, this would have manifested as ruptured eardrums and blood in the middle ear canal, which was not found. If the killer was an experienced diver, they would be aware of this fact, but still may have done it anyway in an attempt to hide the body. But because of the timeline and how demanding this would have been, this scenario was ruled out. The next scenario considered was one of premeditated murder. The killer could have tied a rope to the dive computer, added a weight to it, brought it to the entrance of the cave, and then dropped it down and simply pulled it up and down to simulate the depths achieved and cover the tracks. The body could have then been placed at the bottom at any point in time, and the dive computer would have a falsified version of the events. This scenario, again, was ruled out because of how the cave is shaped. It's highly unlikely that the depth recorded by the dive computer could be achieved without catching on a rock or a ledge, which would have made the initial smooth ascent down to 50 meters almost impossible. The final possibility that was examined was one where MK did actually encounter the initial 2 divers who had gone to search for him shortly after they got back from their dive. It's possible that one of them found MK resting under the roof of the deep gallery when MK was already almost out of air. Upon noticing the rescuer, MK could have panicked and attacked him to try to save himself at all costs. At some point during this attack, MK could have pulled a knife that the rescuer then used to stab MK in defense. After that, the rescuer could have ascended and called the police and given the timeline of events. However, the dive computer showed that the rescue started at 10:46. This was already roughly 45 minutes after MK's dive computer had flatlined at the bottom of the deep gallery, on top of the fact that the other rescuer didn't descend to more than 9 meters, ruling him out as a suspect. So, with all of these other possibilities ruled out, a final situation was considered. This is that sequence of events. On Tuesday, September 10, 2002, MK entered the water at 9:15 shortly after the other party of divers. He then descended down to 9 meters to the cave entrance. After entering the cave, he went directly down the first corridor to reach the spud-off between the deep and shallow galleries. He chose the path to the deep gallery and swam down that corridor and then almost directly down to 50 meters deep in one smooth descent. Upon touching down, MK went directly back up, possibly to exit the cave, but he seems to have mistaken the entrance to the shallow gallery for the exit. This was either due to their close appearance or due to silty conditions, reducing visibility in the cave. He then swam around the labyrinth of tunnels in the shallow gallery for almost 30 minutes, probably panicking, knowing he was lost before finding the corridor to the deep gallery once again. And upon entering the deep gallery, he was already almost out of air and knew that he would soon drown. He seems to have looked around the deep section for a minute or two before resting against the ceiling, contemplating what to do next. He might have been panicking or he might have been calm, but since no one is alive to tell the story, we'll never know exactly. What we do know is that MK was almost certainly afraid of drowning because it seems that he made the horrifying decision to stab himself in the chest to avoid it. It's unclear whether or not MK was conscious in his last moments, but he seems to have inhaled water at some point anyway, making his last moments even more tragic. It's also unclear how much alcohol played a role in impairing his judgment, or how much he was affected by nitrogen narcosis in his final minutes. But after stabbing himself, MK slowly drifted down to the deepest part of the cave in complete darkness, where his body was ultimately found at 54 meters. This conclusion was initially rejected by Croatian military divers who rejected suicide as a possibility, but then the results of the stain further confirmed the conclusions of the forensic team when it was found to have just been some paint that had stained the deck. In addition, the forensic team reasoned that if it had been a murder, there would have been many easier ways to kill someone during a dive. First, MK could have been easily approached from behind, his regulator could have been pulled out, and he would have drowned just the same. The purge button on his equipment could have been pushed, emptying his air cylinder, once again leading to his drowning. And finally, to explain MK's actions in his final moments, there are plenty of cases observed where victims choose suicide over a perceived worse way of dying. For example, in the case of a burning building, victims frequently choose to jump to their death instead of what is perceived as a much worse fate, which is burning to death, and so ultimately MK's death was ruled a suicide. Contributing to his death was his inexperience, the alcohol in his system, and the difficulty of the cave he was diving in. With all that being said, considering that one of the police divers even died while attempting a rescue, it's clear that the Paganitsia Bay cave lines up with the reputation given to it by locals. So, the population distribution in the state of South Australia is really weird. The largest city is the city of Adelaide, just over 1 million people, but the next largest city is Mount Gambier at just 33,000. This makes the second largest city in the entire state over 40 times smaller than the next largest. In fact, the population of Adelaide is larger than all of the rest of the cities in the state combined, which is just kind of weird to think about. And so although Mount Gambier is technically the second largest city in the state, it's really just a small city. Despite its size though, the city is considered to be the most important settlement in the so-called Limestone Coast region. It sits right on the border of South Australia and Victoria, just a few kilometers north of the southern coast. It also happens to have been built on the slopes of a literal volcano, which is also named Mount Gambier. Both the city and the surrounding area are famous for some of these volcanic features, like limestone topography, crystal blue lakes, caves, and sinkholes. On the outskirts of the city are a bunch of farm fields, and these extend all the way to the shores to the south. One of these is just a small, 5-acre area between Mount Gambier and the ocean owned by some dairy farmers known as Thompson's Paddock. In 1938, a farmer was on the field at Thompson's Paddock on a piece of equipment being pulled by his horses when all of a sudden one of his horses tripped and stumbled over something in the grass. The farmer thought that was weird, so he stopped his horses, got off the piece of equipment and walked over to where the horse tripped. What he found was a hole in the ground about a foot across that he hadn't ever noticed before. He got down on his hands and knees to take a look into the hole. And to his surprise, the hole extended for what looked to be at least 20 feet down, and then at the bottom he could see water. This on its own is kind of amazing and creepy, but this was only just the beginning. It's not clear how long the farmer had this field, or why he hadn't noticed the hole in the ground before, and no one is really sure if the horse had caused the ground to collapse or if the hole had always been there and the farmer just hadn't noticed. Either way, that leads to the next question. If the horse had caused the hole to open up, doesn't that mean that it could collapse even further and that the area around the hole was now at risk of collapsing? To make matters worse, he could see from the surface that the narrow opening extended for maybe 2 or 3 feet, but after that, the sides weren't visible. It looked like it widened out, sort of like an upside-down funnel. In a worst-case scenario, imagine someone had been walking in the field and had accidentally stepped into the opening. They would have fallen 20 feet to the water below, and then because of the shape of the upper section, they would have had no way to climb back out. All they've been able to do is tread water and scream helplessly. This was obviously kind of alarming for their farmer as well, because following the discovery of this opening he decided to try to fill the pit with rocks. So over the next little while he began to bring soccer ball-sized stones to the opening and just started dropping them into the water down below. One by one the rocks would make a big splash and then disappear into the dark water, never to be seen again. They reached the first dozen rocks and they just kept disappearing. Then they dumped several dozen into the water. The dozens turned into 100, then hundreds, and there was still no trace of the rocks down below. By the time they eventually gave up, they'd probably dumped thousands of rocks into the strange opening, and still, not a single rock could be seen down in the water. It was like the hole was bottomless. In the end, the farmer would just have to be cautious of the opening and hope that it didn't collapse any further. As you might imagine, news spread of this weird occurrence, and soon enough, people were coming to explore the hole. It was eventually determined to be a limestone sinkhole, where slowly the water had dissolved the rocks below, leading to this large opening just a few feet below the surface. Eventually, this foot-wide hole was widened to be about 3 feet or 1 meter so that could be more easily explored. Then in the mid-60s a diver was lowered into the cave opening for the first time. From the surface, he was lowered 23 feet or 7 meters before finally touching down on the water's surface, and what he saw was that it was actually more like a small lake. Right below the entrance it was narrow, but by the time you're at the water's surface the room was already 56 feet or 17 meters wide. In addition to that, on a sunny day around noon the sunlight shines directly through the opening and creates a sapphire blue beam of light that lights up the room and the water. From then on, the cave was given the name the shaft because of this shaft of light. From the water's surface, the diver began scuba diving down into the cave and found that it just continued to widen out the deeper and deeper you go. In this first exploration, he got down to about 69 feet or 21 meters before ending the dive and deciding to come back up. But the craziest part was that from where he had stopped, he could see all of the rocks that had been dumped into the cave years before. All of those hundreds of rocks looked like a little anthill down at the bottom of this massive room, and they were still at least 50 feet from where he had stopped. The cave was later mapped to have one massive chamber where the rocks were located and then 2 incredibly deep descending arms that extend out in almost opposite directions. The main chamber is 460 feet long and 260 feet wide at its widest, and the top of the rock pile is 118 feet or 36 meters below the surface. Then from the main chamber there's a tunnel that extends northwest to a depth of 260 feet or 80 meters. And then on the opposite side of that there's another tunnel that extends all the way to 407 feet or 124 meters for depth. It's thought that these tunnels could stretch all the way to the southern shores as part of the intricate freshwater drainage system flowing through the mountains in the area. There are also several cliffs, overhangs and restrictions in each of these corridors that make for some interesting features on the way down. These features, coupled with the crystal clear water and the sheer size to explore, make it a cave or stream. Importantly, a really accurate map didn't get made until all the way in 1984, but already by a decade earlier in 1973, 8,000 dives had already taken place inside the shaft. During all of those dives, the full depth of the cave wasn't known and a full map hadn't been made. For all intents and purposes, it was considered to be bottomless. The newness of cave diving and the limitations of the then available equipment meant that cavers just sort of went to the edge of the charted area and then stared off into the abyss wondering how deep the cave went. In May of 1973, a team of 9 divers planned to make what they thought might be a record dive in the shaft. On the 26th, they all arrived in Mount Gambier and set up tents at a campground near the famous Blue Crater Lake. Their goal was to reach the edge of the so-called perimeter at 250 feet of depth. This is essentially the edge of where the light from above filters through. Any deeper and the angle of the ceiling obscures the light, and from then on the water is almost pitch black. This also happens to be right around an area known as the drop-off. It's a point in the cave where the bottom is no longer visible from the edge above. That's what gave the shaft this reputation for being bottomless, because standing at the ledge you can't see anything down below, but it clearly extends much farther. All 9 of the divers planned to make this attempt, were dive instructors, but because this was a fairly ambitious undertaking, they planned to do a practice dive and set up some equipment prior to their real attempt. So the following day on the 27th, they got to the farmhouse on Thompson's paddock, signed the guestbook, and then drove into the grassy field where the entrance is located. They parked alongside the opening and then set up the famous tripod hoist system that many of you will probably be familiar with. This hoist is used to lower the divers into the water down below, and incredibly, despite having been widened, the hole is still too narrow for divers to be lowered wearing their equipment. It has to be lowered separately. On the way up as well, a wire ladder is set up for the divers to climb their way up. Once everyone was in the water, they were amazed to see just how big the room was already at the surface. Next, they set up something known as a shot line, which is what they were there to do that day. This was a line from the surface that was weighted and led directly down to the rock pile. This would make their descent smoother for the record attempt and give them more time to reach the edge. On the practice day, the deepest they went was about 200 feet, which was just around the perimeter of the well within the light of the opening. While they were down there though, they could see the famous edge off in the distance, which was their goal. The bottom of the cave extended horizontally and then just disappeared. After finishing this practice dive and getting a feel for the cave, they returned to Mount Gambier to replace some of the batteries on their lights and refill all of their air cylinders. Then the next day on the 28th, they were back at the opening at noon, suited up and getting lowered back down. One of the divers, a woman named Joan, decided not to dive that day, so it would only be 8 of them instead of 9. She decided to stay up and help with supplies and make food for the rest of them. So the divers who would be entering the cave that day would be Robert, John, Peter, Gordon, Larry, and then 3 siblings Glenn, Stephen, and Christine. The others all dived back down to the rock pile at 130 feet and then continued toward the tunnel where the ledge was located. At about 180 feet, Robert started to really feel the effects of nitrogen narcosis. This is when the nitrogen from the gas diver's breath dissolves in the blood and creates a sort of impaired, almost drunken feeling. This was a bit earlier than he normally felt it, but it was already significant enough that he knew he needed to head back up a little bit to dissipate the feeling. Now is maybe a good time to mention that because diving and cave diving were so new at the time, the protocols used hadn't really been established like they are today. There were a lot of amateurs who were participating in it who really shouldn't have been. Like for example, these divers, although they were instructors, they only had experience in open water and perfectly clear, bright water. The second thing is that there was no requirement to be cave certified. Anyone could just sort of dive wherever they wanted with minimal oversight. But the final and most alarming thing was that the safety protocols were wildly different than what they are today. This group of divers planned to do a dive to a depth of 250 feet on regular air. If you're at all familiar with diving, you know how insane this is. Today, the maximum depth recommended to use regular air is just 130 feet. Beyond that, nitrogen narcosis starts to kick in and can impair your judgment and motor function. At around 185 feet, the air actually becomes toxic and can cause convulsive seizures in some instances. If you were to have a seizure at depth, your mouthpiece just falls out and then you drown. So, taking all that into account, there were now 8 divers in the water on regular air already at 180 feet. Robert signaled to the others that he was heading back to the rock pile and they signaled back to him that they were gonna keep going. He then swam around the rock pile, circling it and checking the area for animal bones that might have sunk to the bottom. About 8 minutes later, he saw Glenn's torch coming toward him. By then, Robert was close to being out of air and so was Glenn, who had been watching his gauges. The two of them caught up with one another and then surfaced at around the same time. Larry surfaced around the same time as well, and then 30 seconds later, Peter surfaced and he had essentially no air left. He also said that he hadn't seen any of the other divers. All of a sudden, everyone's stomach dropped as the realization set in, especially Glenn, whose brother and sister were still down on the wall. Next to no air left. A few minutes earlier, the group that had continued on without Robert were swimming and taking pictures until they got to about 200 feet. Glenn and the others were swimming along a ledge along the bottom and he saw his sister just a few feet away from him. Everything was normal, the light above was still bright, and about 5 minutes total had passed since they started their dive. Around this time, Glenn was feeling kind of groggy from the narcosis and decided that he'd gone far enough as well. He checked his gauges and saw that he was getting low on air. Knew that since everyone had the same amount of air, they'd also be running low. To be on the safe side, he decided to head back up, but before he did, he wanted to signal his sister Christine to let her know that she should probably head up too. He went to tap her on the shoulder, but before he did, she started kicking her fins away from him and then out of reach. Not wanting to spend any more time down there, he figured they'd probably all follow along not too long after him anyway, so he just started up for the surface. Then he met up with Robert and the two of them surfaced together. All hell broke loose in the cave, and a combination of factors led to this being perhaps the deadliest cave diving incident in history. Right before Glenn started heading up, Peter was also feeling pretty impaired by the narcosis and wanted to check Glenn's depth gauge. He swam over to him, but Glenn started heading up before Peter could read it. Peter sat there for a moment, scanning the clear water at the bottom, and then noticed two other divers moving towards the exit. He checked how much air he had left, and that's when he realized that time was up. Then he turned to where he thought the exit was and realized that the cave had gone almost completely dark, and he had no idea which way the exit was. That day, shortly after the group entered the cave, clouds moved into the area and severely limited the amount of light shining through the opening. Peter started swimming around, searching for the exit, but in just a few short moments the area had become heavily silted and divers were scattered all over the place. 3 of these divers had been grouped together near the deepest section any of them had explored. In order, Christine was in front. Gordon was next and then Larry was in behind. Larry and Gordon checked their gauges and realized they were dangerously low on air. They signaled it was time to head up and then in a panic started swimming almost directly upward rather than diagonally with the ceiling. In these limestone caves sometimes pieces of rock cleave off and create dome-shaped depressions in the ceiling. It's thought that the expelled gases from the divers had collected in one of these pockets and created a mirror-like effect on the ceiling, similar to what the surface near the entrance would have looked like. In their impaired state, their flashlights bounced off this mirror and in their panic they thought they were swimming in the right direction. Then they would have swam directly up and hit the ceiling right above them. Gordon and Christine started frantically waving their flashlights around, terrified, looking for the exit. Right then, Larry's light went out. He dropped away from the ceiling for a moment and miraculously it turned back on, and because he had drifted down he managed to see another diver off in the distance. He swam toward the diver and then the angle was just enough for him to see the real entrance far ahead. He bolted for the entrance and surfaced right around the time Glenn and Robert did. Peter had also managed to find his way out of the silt and surfaced right after Larry. Upon seeing that 4 people were still missing, including his brother and sister, Glenn immediately grabbed a spare tank and dove back down to try to find them. He got to the edge of the cliff at 225 feet and found his brother's flashlight and camera resting on the bottom. He also found that any further in was completely silted out, visibility was basically zero. But desperately wanting to find his siblings, he went over the drop-off and into the silt. As soon as he entered the cloud, he couldn't even see the hand in front of his face and he started to panic. He immediately swam back out and entered the edge of the rock pile, and then he just stared at the abyss for some time, hoping to see any sign of them. Eventually, he was forced to return to the surface. Peter went down following Glenn's return, but he also found nothing. By then, an ambulance had arrived, and everyone knew there was no hope of finding anyone alive. Shortly after that, police arrived and planned for a body recovery the next day. Police divers went down into the shaft and got to 200 feet but found that the cave was still very silted out. They were already at the limit of their capabilities and weren't able to locate any of the bodies that day or the day after during a second search. Following the second search, police called off entirely until they could get additional training from the Navy because the depth of the recovery was groundbreaking and pushing the edge of the training they had. This would take at least several months to get their recovery squad up to speed. The landowners led a film crew who were making a cave diving documentary and entered the cave to do some filming. The crew had already filmed several of the others in the area and wanted to include the shaft as well. On the 22nd, they got down to about 50 feet of depth and using professional lighting equipment, they lit up the cave so bright that it was like daylight inside. While they were getting set up, a technician was looking at 2 of his teammates when he noticed what looked like a third person behind them. Kind of freaked out, they went over to inspect the ear and realized that it was a body in a wetsuit. They immediately stopped all filming and surfaced and called the police to let them know someone had been found. The next day, police retrieved the body, which was stuck under a narrow ledge just 50 feet deep into the water. They went down to 180 feet that same day and still weren't able to find any of the others. The one they did recover was later determined to be Stephen, one of the siblings. By March of that year, the landowners had become increasingly uncomfortable that there were still 3 people somewhere down the cave, so they sought the help of some more experienced divers with better equipment. On March 9 of 1974, this team of divers went down and began a search of their own and would find a person lying on their back at 185 feet on the bottom. They also found another person directly underneath them. Then 20 feet deeper, they found the final individual, the body of John, beneath a rock ledge. His body wasn't able to be recovered until a month later in April because of the depth and the way the body was wedged. Almost a year earlier, on that fateful day, it's thought that Christine and Gordon had run out of air while in the dome-shaped pocket on the ceiling. It's been suggested that they died holding one another, knowing they were out of air and there was nothing they could do. This is why they were recovered so closely together. It's not clear exactly who saw John, but one of the survivors mentioned seeing another diver swimming strongly deeper into the cave while everyone else was returning to the surface. This is thought to have been John who was found the deepest in. It's thought that he was severely affected by nitrogen narcosis and that's why he was going in the opposite direction. Finally, not much is known about Stephen's final moments. He was obviously found much higher than the rest of them along the ceiling instead of the bottom. When he was found, his buoyancy device was inflated, which kept him buoyant and stuck to the roof. It's possible that in the silt or in the dark, he tried to find the exit by floating to the ceiling and then crawling along it. He might have then run out of air before making it out. However, since no one saw him, we'll never really know his final moments. This accident, as far as I can tell, is the worst in cave diving history. And in the few years preceding this incident, there were several other fatal incidents in nearby sinkholes in the Mount Gambier area. The shaft disaster was the final straw and led to the establishment of the Cave Divers Association of Australia with the goal of regulating the industry to prevent further tragedies from occurring. With the benefit of hindsight, we know that these divers should not have entered the cave without specific knowledge of cave diving. It's also easy to criticize their use of air instead of a mix, but back then specialized gas mixtures just weren't widely available. They also should have used guidelines to explore those uncharted sections to avoid getting lost when the cave silted out or when it became dark. And in fact, these divers knew that lines should be used, but decided not to use them because of the size of the group they had. They knew that the lines would likely get tangled, which would have been even more dangerous. In reality, for a dive like they did, they should have simply had a smaller group where lines could have been used. Thankfully, following the establishment of the CDA and other similar organizations, the rate of cave dive deaths has been drastically reduced ever since. Virivkina Cave. At 7,257 feet deep, Virivkina Cave is the deepest cave on Earth. The cave is so deep that it takes over 4 days and thousands of feet of rope to descend to its immense depth. And certainly, what would the deepest cave be without a couple of horrifying incidents? On the border of Russia and Georgia is a mountain range known as the Caucasus Mountains. This mountain range is notable for a few reasons. First, it's home to Europe's highest peak, Mount Elbrus at 18,500 feet. Then, on the western side of the region of Abkhazia is a subrange of the Caucasus Mountains known as the Gagra Range. There are some decent-sized mountains in this area as well. The highest among them is just over 11,000 feet, but this area is notable for another reason. The Gagra Range is primarily a limestone mountain range carved out by rivers over its geological history. The prehistoric rivers created a bunch of deep canyons and the largest caves on Earth that are currently known. In fact, the Gagra Mountains are home to 4 of the deepest caves anywhere on Earth, and the deepest of these is Virivkina Cave at over 7,000 feet deep. For context, that's the same as stacking 23 Statue of Liberties on top of one another. The entrance to Virivkina Cave is also located at an altitude of 7,500 feet, meaning that you have to climb up a literal mountain to get to it. Once you're up there, you're still surrounded by the rocky cliffs of the mountain ranges, looking hole in the ground. It's obvious that it's the entrance to a cave, but you'd never expect it to descend for over a mile into the earth. When the entrance was first discovered in 1968 by a group of cavers, they only descended down to a depth of 377 feet before returning to the surface. Then in 1983, the cave was discovered for a second time by a separate team of speleologists from the Pyrii Vespelio Club from Moscow. Over the next 3 years, a series of expeditions pushed the depth to around 1,400 feet, but then for reasons that are unclear, there were no more expeditions until the year 2000. Work resumed again that year, but it would take all the way until 2015 to discover a new shaft that would unlock the true depth of Verevkina Cave. By 2017, they had extended the maximum depth of the cave from 1,400 feet all the way to 7,200 feet and mapped over 17 kilometers of tunnel and passages. Then finally in March of 2018, the official deepest point of the cave was discovered at the bottom of a subterranean lake where the cave meets the water table, giving Verevkina Cave a total depth of 7,257 feet or 2,212 meters. 6 months later in September, the Perervo team returned once again to continue exploring the cave, and this time they were joined by photographers Robbie Stone and Jeff Wade. It was this same team of world-class cavers from the Perervo Club that made all of the seminal descents of Verevkina and of the other deep caves in the Gagra mountain range. Led by team leader Pavel Demidov, this expedition would be returning to the bottom of Verevkina Cave to collect samples of some of the potentially undiscovered species and explore some of the promising horizontal passages at the bottom of the cave, all while having Robbie and Jeff document the entire thing. Now, in an ordinary cave of moderate depth, where you can descend and ascend in a single day, you'd still be bringing a decent amount of equipment because you need food and a bunch of climbing gear for every single person on the team. In caves as large as Verevkina Cave, the descent is more similar to an expedition that you'd expect to see when climbing a tall mountain. If you've ever watched anything related to Mount Everest, you may have heard of the multi-camp system. These camps are established higher and higher up the mountain to store food and gear and for the climbers to sleep and stay in between climbing. For multi-day expeditions on a mountain or in a deep enough cave, the amount of gear becomes way too much to transport at a single time. People have to climb up and down in advance to transport load after load of the necessary equipment to ensure a safe attempt. And Verevkina Cave is no different. In fact, because of how deep it is, it has a total of 6 camps at various depths on the way to the bottom. From the entrance, climbers have to put on special clothing, harnesses, and helmets fixed with headlamps. They then descend down the first shaft into the darkness and move through a series of tight tunnels and passages to reach the first camp at 2,000 feet. This camp is a permanently installed camp where gear and equipment are stored year-round for emergencies. Then, over the course of the next 4 days, Robbie, Jeff, and the Perervo Speleo Club made their way to Camp 6 all the way down at 6,900 feet. On their way, the temperature was just a few degrees above freezing. They crawled through mud and water, in possibly tight squeezes, and descended down 100-foot shafts over nothing but air. The thousands of feet of ropes that they used to make the descent were their only means of transportation in and out. Then finally they set foot onto the flat sandy Camp 6 set up in a large horizontal tunnel. This would be their home for the remainder of the expedition. Over the next 3 days the team set out from their camp to complete all of the tasks they had intended. One of these was to bring Robbie and Jeff to the lake that sits at the bottom. When they got there, they were stunned to see this beautiful turquoise water surrounded by jet black limestone. The lake is 50 feet long, 25 feet wide, and is actually 28 feet deep. If not for the lights that they brought, it would sit there in complete darkness, entirely without color. On day 7, everything was still going according to plan, and that day, 2 of the members of the team had to leave early to catch a flight home. When they got up to Camp 3, there was a ton of water pouring into the cave. A massive storm up on the surface had caused a flood pulse to send thousands of liters of water rushing in. Inside these caves you can't really communicate wirelessly because of the thick layers of rock, so instead, cavers have to run a physical line the entire length of the cave to communicate. The 2 team members immediately tapped into the cable to warn the others about the flood pulse headed their way. Down at Camp 6, they weren't all that worried when they initially got the call. Flood pulses are a common thing that cavers have to worry about. A single milliliter of rain is 1 liter per square meter, meaning that a single square kilometer receives 1,000 liters of water if just a single milliliter of rain falls. In heavy rain, that number is significantly higher. All of this water then bursts down into caves in equally huge volumes and can last for hours depending on the volume of rain and how long it rains for. Again, they weren't all that worried when they first got the call. The Parevo group is world-class and their plan was to monitor the water level and then plan accordingly. Camp 6 had also been set up off of the main vertical shaft in what looked to be an area away from the flow of water. It was also at 6,900 feet, whereas the total depth was over 7,200 feet. For the water to reach them, it would have to fill up 300 feet of passages below them before it would reach them. About half an hour after they received the call, they heard the first sound of water approaching. It started off as a faint rumble and slowly grew like a train approaching. By the time it was just about to reach camp, it was so roaring loud that it was almost deafening. The entire cave shook like a constant earthquake was going on. Robbie had just started breakfast when the noise really started, and he and the others rushed out of their tents to see the approaching storm. As they turned their headlights towards the vertical shaft, a fire hose of water came pouring down. Robbie stood there with his mouth open and almost dropped the food he was holding. Not nearly as experienced as the Prevo team, Robbie was really concerned by the volume and speed of the water rushing in, but again the spot they were in was completely dry, so he tried to stay calm like his Russian comrades. About 2 hours into the flooding, with no signs of it slowing, one of the team members noticed a gurgling sound coming from a small hole near the tent. He looked into the hole and couldn't see any water, but he figured he should tell the team leader anyway. Pavel agreed that this was a bit concerning, so they decided to go and check out a nearby siphon to see how much the water table had risen. They returned about 5 minutes later and looked to the hole once again. This time, not only could they see water, but it was rising so fast it was sloshing up around against the walls and almost out of the hole. The team member looked back at Robbie and Robbie saw that his face had gone completely white. Immediately he knew that this meant that they needed to leave and leave right away. With the sound of water still almost deafening, all hell broke loose in the camp. No one expected to be leaving that day, but now everyone was running around packing up essential gear. Robbie and Jeff pulled on their latex suits over their fleece base layer. After that, they slipped on their abrasion-resistant nylon shells and harnesses. Robbie then made the tough decision to leave all of his camera equipment and personal items. Literally tens of thousands of dollars of equipment. He knew he couldn't risk being slowed down, or it could cost him his life or the life of one of his teammates. He pulled all of the memory cards out of the cameras, placed them in a Ziploc bag, and then slipped them into his latex suit. At the very least, he could save all of the pictures he had taken. With that, he called out to the others that he and Jeff would start their ascent, and then they started off with the vertical shaft out of the quickly flooding Camp 6. This would be the last interaction that they would have with the Russians at Camp 6. The remaining members of the Pervo team would wait for the team leader, Powell, before starting their ascent. As Robbie and Jeff made their way to the vertical ropes, they reached a narrow traverse, almost like a bridge that went along one wall. Prior to the flooding, the chamber beside the bridge was 60 feet deep and 25 feet wide of nothing but air. Now it was almost completely flooded, almost coming up over the side of the bridge. At the end of this narrow traverse were the vertical ropes and the source of the water pouring into the cave. Robbie stepped into the waterfall pouring down from the shaft and clipped his ascenders to the rope. Then he put his head down, took a deep breath, and started making his way up the rope as the water pummeled him from above. The water was coming down so hard it felt like it was crushing and suffocating him. It was literally as if his head was being squashed into his shoulders. Thankfully, he was able to tuck his chin, which allowed the water to run off of his helmet and create a small air pocket for him to breathe. Focusing on just the white rope directly in front of his face, he moved his ascenders up rhythmically as fast as he could. Finally, he reached an area with a small outcropping that he could step on and out of the waterfall to look up. He saw that the rope was coming out of a shoulder-sized hole in the rocks, but this was also the source of the water. Coming out of this little hole was a fire hose of water that seemed to take up the entire space. He thought to himself that there was no way he was going to be able to make it through that intense downpour. At the same time, he couldn't just stop, he was the lead climber. Everyone else was coming up behind him, and there was no telling what the water was like down below. He had to at least try to make it through. When he got to the hole, the force of the water was so strong that he was only able to push his ascenders a couple inches at a time. He finally made it through the squeeze, and then realized that Jeff would have to do the same thing. He had no idea whether or not Jeff would be able to make it, so he just kept climbing as high as he could to get out of the way. In his panic, he hadn't realized that this new section of the cave was mostly dry. The water flowed down a different route to the squeeze, so he was relatively safe where he was. But because he was so full of adrenaline, he was mindlessly climbing for his life as fast and as high as he could. He only finally realized what he was doing when Jeff yelled out to him to slow down. Snapping out of it, he stopped and waited for Jeff to catch up before they continued. When Jeff reached him, his face was white, his eyes were wide, but he exclaimed that they were at least alive. The two of them silently wondered if the same could be said for the Perivo team down below. Robbie and Jeff eventually made it up to Camp 5 at 6,200 feet where they waited, hoping they would see the Russians any minute. As the cave continued to shake around them, they occasionally looked down over the edge into the abyss. Miraculously, down below they saw a single headlamp slowly making its way up the shaft. When he was finally close enough, they realized it was Andre. After he climbed up into camp, they asked him if he had seen the others, and he just shook his head silently. They all sat there, thinking about the worst-case scenario. Down below, by the time Pavel had returned from the siphon, the bridge that Robbie and Jeff had walked across was completely submerged. The rest of the team members had to actually swim to reach the vertical ropes. The last to swim out was Pavel, and as he was making his way out, the chamber had become a swirling vortex. All of the water draining deeper into the cave had turned into a giant whirlpool. When he went through it, it spun him around and he had to swim hard to make it to the line. By the time they were ascending, all of the deeper passages were completely submerged in water. Then, 15 minutes after Andrea emerged, 5 more lights could be seen making their way up the shaft. One by one, all of the remaining members of the Perivo team made their way up to Camp 5. Robbie watched them ascend out of the flooded passage and couldn't believe how strong and capable they were. One team member was even carrying a stove and 4 sleeping bags attached to his harness. He thought to himself how glad he was that it was him and Jeff that had gone first. If they had been the ones to climb up last, it's likely that they wouldn't have survived. And then when they climbed up into camp, they were quickly in the tent, having coffee and laughing about the entire ordeal. Robbie, on the other hand, was still thoroughly freaked out. For hours he refused to take off his gear and kept looking down into the chasm to see if the water was still rising. 200 feet above them was a horizontal passage that they needed to pass to move higher into the cave. Normally, it's already half filled with water and you have to crawl through it. With all of the flooding, it was completely filled with water. As long as the flooding continued, they were trapped and just had to hope that the water didn't continue to rise higher. Pavel reassured Robbie that they would wait until morning to let the water clear, and then over the course of the next 16 hours at the camp, the roaring of the water slowly died down. The flood pulse ultimately lasted a total of 20 hours and was the result of a week of rain, followed by a single severe storm. The week of rain had completely saturated the ground, so by the time the storm happened, the water poured relentlessly into Verkina Cave. They later learned from a cab driver that the raindrops from the storm had been the size of nickels. This was actually a good learning experience for the team. They had previously been operating under the assumption that the cave only flooded in the wintertime. To watch for rain, another camp was installed in the lower chambers to provide another escape point in the event of flooding, and despite this expedition being cut short, they had completed essentially everything they had set out to do. New passages had been explored and mapped, cave species had been sampled, and although the camera equipment was destroyed, all of the pictures were preserved. But this wouldn't be the last accident to ever occur in Verkina Cave. Some people exploring the area noticed a rope fixed to the cave's entrance. This is typically a big no-no in the caving world because then anyone can access the cave and potentially get hurt or lost if they're unprepared. 8 months later, on August 4, 2021, the same Perivo team returned to continue their work in Verkina Cave. They descended into the cave as they had 3 years earlier, but then at 1,300 feet they found a pair of crampons and an ice axe. This didn't make sense. This equipment couldn't have just fallen into the cave from the entrance. There were no straight drops to where the equipment was found. This meant that someone had to have come into the cave and deep into the cave. They continued further in, all the way to the permanent camp at 2,000 feet, then to the second camp at 3,200 feet, and then all the way at 3,600 feet, halfway into the deepest cave on Earth, they found the badly decomposed body of a man. He was wearing camouflage overalls, trekking boots, a helmet. He had 2 cell phones, and he was still attached to the rope that he had used to descend into the cave. By the looks of the decomposition, he had been there for months. Although he had no ID on him when he was found, authorities were able to identify the man as 37-year-old Sergei Koseff using a missing persons database. Then, using the information from the cell phones found on him, they were able to figure out what had happened that led to his death. Sergei lived in the city of Sochi, Russia, just east of the Russian border with Georgia, and about 2 hours from the entrance to Verkhina Cave. He was an avid outdoorsman and frequently went on solo expeditions to explore the wilderness. On November 1, 2020, he said goodbye to his family as he always did when he was going on one of these solo expeditions and then set off for the Gagra Mountains. He also didn't tell them where he was going despite the fact that he was heading to a location that fewer people had set foot in than the International Space Station. Based on the documents and screenshots found on his phone, it seems that Sergei had spent almost a year planning this trip. He had printed out maps and materials from the expeditions made by the Parivo team specifically to navigate down into the cave. First, he made the ascent up into the mounds to the cave entrance using his crampons and ice axe. Then he fixed a rope to the opening and descended down into the darkness of Verkhina Cave. Using the information that he had gathered from the Parivo team, he hauled all of his equipment into the cave. 3 transport bags through the tunnels and narrow passages. Then using a lattice descender, he traveled down the massive vertical shafts all alone. He successfully made it to the first camp and then left some of the equipment later discovered by the Parivo team and then proceeded almost directly to the second camp. It was determined by the excrement found on site that he lived at the second camp for about a week before descending further into the cave. From the second camp, things got a bit more challenging. Beyond that camp there are some larger and more technically challenging vertical shafts. In addition, the cave becomes significantly wetter from that point onward. As any caver knows, proper equipment is crucial. The standard fleece underlayer with a waterproof outer layer is crucial to surviving the cold and wet subterranean environment. It's unclear exactly what happened in Sergei's last moment, but it seems as though he realized that he wouldn't be able to descend any further through the water with the equipment he had. At which point he would have tried to make his way back up the cave, but because he had already descended into a technically challenging area, he was unable to get back out. Sergei had brought ascenders for his hands, but he didn't have any stirrups for his feet, meaning that he had no footholds for any of the long vertical shafts. He must have tried to make his way out of the cave, but between the exhaustion and the cold, he eventually laid down to sleep one last time and never woke up. Upon finding his body, the Parivo team went back up to the surface and alerted authorities. Due to the difficulty of the cave and the depth that Sergei's body was found at, it would take a team of over 100 individuals to eventually retrieve it. It's also particularly risky to be in a confined space like a cave with a decomposing body because the gases given off from the decomposition process can build up and become toxic at high enough levels. Despite how many people were involved in the rescue, they still ended up having to cut Sergei into pieces to successfully remove him from the cave. After his retrieval, his body was finally returned to his wife and kids in Sochi. For now, Verkhina Cave is the deepest cave on Earth. But the Earth is a big place, and caves are not nearly as readily viewable as their mountain counterparts. It remains to be seen whether it will hold its place as the deepest on Earth. In the deep ocean, there are creatures that are truly the stuff of nightmares. The water, pressure, and darkness have all forced them to adapt in unique and horrifying ways, many of which seem to be almost alien-like in appearance. Historically, there have been a lot of bad jobs, and not just boring bad, I mean super dangerous lose your life or your limbs bad. For example, railroad work is one of these jobs that is typically considered to be a dangerous job even today. And this is even more true historically, when workers used to have to go in between moving cars to couple and uncouple them from one another. If anything went wrong, if workers slipped or made a small error, they could easily fall underneath and get run over or get squished in between the two massive cars. In fact, some railroad companies even had surgeons on site at all times because of the likelihood and severity of the injuries. And unfortunately, railroad work is not unique in this. During the Industrial Revolution, job conditions were exceptionally bad compared to today's standards. All of the new equipment and machinery hadn't been perfected yet or made very safe, so things would frequently catch fire. There were also no safety covers or safety fences, meaning that you constantly ran the risk of losing an arm or leg or worse. Pre-workplace safety and pre-modernization, there was essentially nothing to protect the workers, so people worked 12 to 16-hour days, 6 days a week, often in just dim light from the windows in the factory because there weren't even any light bulbs yet. These factories and machines were also powered by steam created by fires, so there was often smoke everywhere, causing many workers to suffer from lung and eye issues later in life. And these conditions were more or less the norm for decades. The Industrial Revolution started in the 1760s in England, giving birth to these awful conditions, and there would be no major changes to safety standards until 60 years later in 1833 as a response to just how many injuries were occurring in the workplace. Unfortunately, these improvements were only the first of many in the world. It would take over a century to get us to where we are today. And even then, significant improvements to workplace safety were still occurring in many places well into the 20th century. Now, based on the analytics of my channel, it seems that the majority of you are from the US, with the next significant segments coming from other developed countries around the quote-unquote West. Which makes sense, given that you probably need to understand English to understand my videos and you need easy access to the open internet. This also means that the majority of us, myself included, are very fortunate to live in countries where safety regulations are what they are. Many of these horrifically dangerous jobs still exist worldwide in some capacity, but even in the developed world, there are still some jobs that are inherently risky. These are jobs that, much like the Industrial Revolution, the technology simply does not exist yet to perform them more safely. One of these jobs is commercial diving, in particular, something known as saturation diving. Saturation diving is primarily used in the oil and gas industry to set up and maintain oil rigs. This includes tasks like welding, tightening bolts, or even just switching large valves on pipelines. If you've seen some of my other diving videos, you're probably familiar with the fact that when scuba divers breathe gas at high pressures, some of these gases dissolve into their blood and tissues. When the divers resurface, these gases then diffuse out of the tissues again, but crucially, this takes time. If divers ascend too quickly, these turn into large bubbles like a shake-in in an open-to-pop bottle. This can cause several physiological effects ranging from mild decompression sickness to serious life-threatening conditions. When severe enough, these bubbles can cause tissue damage and block the veins and arteries leading to vital organs, which can then be fatal. To combat this, divers ascend in stages based on the time and depth of the dive to allow all of the gases to diffuse safely. In commercial diving, the depths and times required for the work to be completed make it entirely impractical. Go through the normal decompression following each day. For example, just a single hour at 250 feet of depth requires 5 hours of decompression, so you can only imagine how much would be required for a full day of work. Instead, commercial divers enter a metal chamber known as a dive bell. This chamber is actually a living quarters attached to a large cable that is then lowered into the water. The cable supplies the living quarters with gas and electricity, and the dive bell has weights on it so that it will sink to the correct depth. This tiny metal chamber on the sea floor. This is more practical because eventually the dissolved gases fully saturate the tissues around the body, meaning that after a certain period of time at depth, the decompression time is the same regardless of how long you're there. Theoretically, divers can live and work at depth indefinitely and always have the same 8-day decompression period. And yes, you did hear that correctly, it takes 8 days to fully decompress after full saturation. And although saturation divers are quite well paid for what they do, these conditions are obviously incredibly bizarre, bordering on horrifying. The space itself is cramped, hot, and humid. There's usually no natural light because these typically occur at depths of between 65 and 1,000 feet. But the conditions on the dives themselves are, in my opinion, much, much worse. In the pitch-black water, light barely travels any distance. On top of that, there are particles in the water that give it an almost smoke-like appearance. It's been described as being in a void where the only thing that exists are you and the rig that you're working on. And if that wasn't bad enough, the combination of pressure, nothingness, and the mixture of gases can make the diver's senses a bit weird on occasion, adding to the already surreal experience. Not to mention the fact that divers will frequently catch glimpses of large sea creatures moving quickly just at a view of their lights. It's almost as if they're being watched or hunted at all times. You can't quite see what's out there, but it feels as though you're being watched, and occasionally you can feel the water shift rapidly around you and behind you. And finally, if all of this wasn't already bad enough, the soundtrack to this nightmare is the deep groaning of the rig and the seafloor, creating an ominous, bass drum-like noise. Truly the stuff of nightmares. As you might imagine, if something goes wrong at these depths, the divers are completely trapped because of the decompression sickness they'd experience if they were to be brought up quickly. And depending on where these dives are taking place and how deep they are, the water can be very cold, adding the risk of hypothermia to an already dangerous situation. It's for this reason that commercial diving has one of the highest fatality rates of any profession. Divers can become tangled in the lines, drown, panic, and obviously suffer from severe decompression sickness. Another horrifying one to think about is dives that are conducted that are not directly on the seafloor. This would be a situation where the dive bell is sort of hanging part of the way down the rig. It's theoretically possible that a diver could become untethered and accidentally fall away from the rig, only to plunge into the abyss below to the pitch-black seafloor. In any case, on January 16, 1974, two men were working on a rig in the North Sea. The North Sea is a fairly cold body of water, with surface temperatures ranging from 13 to 18 Celsius or 55 to 66 Fahrenheit. The upper end of that range can easily induce hypothermia in swimmers, and the seafloor is often much colder than that. The two men were working at a depth of 250 feet or 76 meters and were on their first dive of the operation. They slipped into their gear and then proceeded to get the dive bell ready by opening and closing all of the appropriate valves for chamber pressure and other functions. Then they popped open the bottom hatch and hopped into the water to start their work. At first, everything seemed to be normal, except that particular dive bell had been modified, but the instructions for its operation had not been updated. This meant that one of the valves they moved was in the wrong position. As they started their work, pressure was slowly building inside of a locking mechanism, holding the weight to the bottom of the dive bell. This weight keeps the dive bell negatively buoyant, so eventually, when the pressure was high enough, the locking mechanism opened and let go of the weight. This then caused the dive bell to rapidly ascend, dragging the divers with it all the way up to the surface. By the time the dive bell reached the surface, the men had died due to a combination of drowning and severe decompression sickness. And this was unfortunately one of the many deaths that occurred early in the history of saturation diving due to the newness of the technology. It is now no longer possible to accidentally release a dive belt weight like they did. But this was also not the first or last saturation diving death. There are some recent and particularly horrifying incidents that have gotten a lot of attention. Scott Castle is an American explorer, underwater filmmaker, and ocean pioneer who has worked with several large productions like Disney, MTV, Discovery, Animal Planet, and the History Channel. Known largely for his expert diving, Scott has recorded over 13,000 hours and 20 years of experience in the water. During that time, he set several records, including the record for the longest distance traveled by a diver at a total of 52 miles. Growing up in California, Scott worked as an underwater welder in his teens and has continued diving ever since. At some point he got into film and television and was able to combine it with his skill and passion as a diver. During this time as well, he developed a fascination for the Humboldt squid and would spend a decade working on various projects involving them, and it's easy to see why he would be so fascinated by them. The Humboldt squid, also known as the jumbo squid, but not to be confused with the giant or colossal squid, is a predatory cephalopod that lives primarily in the eastern Pacific Ocean. Their bodies typically reach about 5 feet or 1.5 meters in length or so, and their tentacles usually add another several feet in length. Like other members of the species, the Humboldt squid can change colors instantly between shades of white and red and typically live at depths of between 660 feet and 2,300 feet. They also live just 1 to 2 years on average, which is incredible considering how big they get in that time. It's possibly for this reason that they've developed a reputation for being voracious predators. It's thought that these squids routinely eat 30% or more of their body weight during their first life cycle, which occasionally includes members of their own group. When food availability is low, the squid are known to cannibalize the smaller individuals of the species. Unsurprisingly, they also have a reputation for being aggressive towards humans when they're feeding, which is pretty horrifying when you consider that they can travel up to 15 miles per hour or 24 kilometers per hour. Once they've caught up to you, they can grab a hold of you with their 8 arms that have 100 to 200 suckers each that are also lined with up to 36 teeth. They also have 2 longer additional tentacles for feeding on top of that, which amount to tens of thousands of teeth to grab a hold of something. And instead of having teeth in their mouth, they have something that might be worse, which is a large pear-like beak. Each bite from this beak can take a fist-sized portion of flesh and is known to bite right through the thick bone of a tuna's head like nothing. Theoretically, a bite from one of these beaks could fairly easily amputate your hand from your arm if a Humboldt bit your wrist in the right spot. Even worse, they're also known to hunt in groups of dozens or more. Typically, one squid will come and check to see if something is prey and vulnerable. And if it determines that to be the case, the entire group will descend on the animal ferociously. Now, for whatever reason, the first time that Scott got in the water with the Humboldt squids, he wasn't properly informed about the risks. After jumping into the water, he started looking through his camera when suddenly a squid came from behind him and yanked on his camera. The force of the pull was so strong that it immediately pulled his arm from his socket. Then, as he was reeling in pain from the bite, 2 other squids grabbed his fins and started pulling him deeper into the water. This happened so quickly that one of his eardrums actually burst from the rapid increase in pressure. Still sinking, Scott started viciously fighting back, hitting the squid and using his camera to fight them off. He was finally able to break free and get back up to the surface, where thankfully the squid seemed to lose interest. In the attack as well, one of the squid had also taken a bite of his wrist and broken it in 5 places, which I guess is lucky considering how much worse it could have been. A few years later, now about 5 years into studying the Humboldt squid, Scott was preparing to make a dive the Sea of Cortez in the Gulf of California, filming for a documentary known as The Man-Eating Squid. By then, he was well aware of the dangers of diving with Humboldts, and this was only strengthened by talking to the local fishermen who frequently encountered them. In fact, in that area of Mexico, the Humboldt squid is known as Ralo Diablo, which translates to Red Demon. The fisherman explained to him that there were plenty of stores of people accidentally falling into the water and then getting pulled into deep water by the squid to be eaten. Coupled with his own harrowing experience, Scott took every precaution in preparation for the dive. He'd even developed special equipment to ensure his safety. This included an armor suit that covered most of his body, armor plating for the vulnerable areas of his gas tanks and rebreather, chainmail gloves, and a 250-foot steel cable attached to him from the boat. Then in late afternoon he rolled off of the side and into the water. At about 45 feet, the water began to darken. Off in the distance, he could sort of see the squid moving around as they disturbed chest and plankton. As he approached 80 feet, it looked almost as though he was approaching the seafloor, but this was actually a massive cloud of plankton. His fins gently brushed through the cloud as he descended, but then just as he hit about chest level, a large squid head popped out of the cloud not too far in front of him. Before his vision was obscured by the cloud, he watched as the squid flashed from a white to an ominous deep red. Once he was fully engulfed in the cloud, his vision was essentially zero. Turning on his headlight made no difference because the light reflected right back off blinded him. He just had to wait blindly as he slowly descended to the other side of the plankton. When he finally exited the cloud, the water was darker as less and less of the light filtered from above. As he estimated visibility to be about 65 feet or so, he noticed a large trail of bubbles rising from below. This meant that some large animal was swimming somewhere deep below him and letting out air. It was possibly a whale or some other large mammal, but the scariest of all to him was the Sidorka or false killer whale. Of everything he didn't want to run into, the false killer whale was highest on his list because of the danger it could pose to him. And as he sat there thinking about the ominous trail of bubbles, a group of 30 or so humbled squids came flying at him and then past him. He sort of watched as they went by him and then whipped back around, worrying about what could have caused them to do that. He quickly scanned the direction they came from, trying to see if anything was there, but then his brain caught up to the glance that he made behind him and realized there had been a large shape in the water, sitting motionless in the distance. He slowly turned around to realize he was face to face with a huge, humbled squid about 10 feet away. Scott sat there frozen, looking at the large creature, not sure what to do. Then as he slowly lifted his camera, hoping to get a shot, the squid rushed directly at him and slammed into his chest. The force of the blow knocked the wind out of him as the squid then wrapped its arms around him. All he could hear was the sound of its beak grinding against his chest plate. Finally, it let go and backed away from him, almost as if it was serving to see if it had done any damage. But behind this massive squid now there were dozens of smaller ones that seemed to be watching and waiting for a signal to attack. As the squid watched him, Scott noticed that it had scars all over one side of its body and it was missing part of one of its tentacles. He briefly wondered what had caused that and also noticed just how much larger it was than the rest of the squid. He estimated that its body was close to 7 feet long and at least 3 feet thick around. It also looked to be well over 200 pounds, compared to the average Humboldt which is only around 100 pounds. Upon noticing this, he was acutely aware of the fact that it could still probably kill him if it launched an all-out attack. The plating he was wearing had weak points, so if it just started biting at random, it would start to get through to his flesh. As Scott sat there with his heart pounding, the squid started slowly swimming in circles around him, almost as if it was scanning him. As it did this, waves of white and red rippled across its body, and each of them stared back at one another for a long while. In fact, this would go on for about 10 minutes as more and more squid gathered in the area. At some point, the squid became interested in Scott's camera, so he held it out and let it examine it. In response, the squid wrapped its tentacles around the camera and tried to bite the lens. Finally, after a long while of swimming slowly around him and feeling different parts of his body and equipment, the squid hovered a few feet away and flashed a deep red, then a bright white. Over his years of studying the Humboldt squid, he'd frequently seen this right before squid left after an attack. This would prove to be true once again as the squid then turned upside down and then down into the darkness. Scott watched in amazement as it slowly disappeared out of view. Suddenly, one of the other squids slammed into his chest, then another bit his wrist, then others grabbed at his fins, then it seemed as though there were dozens attacking him all at once. Thankfully, they were smaller so they weren't doing much damage, but finding them off was quickly tiring him out. With that, he decided he should probably end his dive and head back to the surface. He got back up to the cloud of plankton and the squid seemed to have a hard time tracking him as he made his way through the cloud. Then, by the time he exited, they had lost interest entirely as another school of sardines had caught their attention. From that point onward, his decompression stops were uneventful as he watched the Humboldt squid hunt the sardines until he finally resurfaced. This experience really makes you wonder what might occur during an encounter with some of the much larger squid species. In particular, the largest species of squid, the colossal squid, are almost horrifyingly large. The largest ever confirmed colossal squid was 1,091 pounds, which is roughly 10 times the size of the average Humboldt squid. However, beaks found in the stomachs of whales suggest that they might grow even larger, to between 1,300 and 1,500 pounds. Colossal squid also reach lengths between 33 and 46 feet and have the largest eyes of any living creature to ever exist on Earth. It's because of this squid and the other large species, the giant squid, that the myth of the Kraken even exists. It's not hard to imagine these massive tentacles coming out of the ocean and wrapping around people or smaller boats. although these instances are exceptionally rare. Their main predators are sperm whales, and sperm whales often have large scars on their backs which are thought to be the result of the massive hooks on the tentacles of these squids as they fight off the whales. There is something uniquely terrifying about the image of the deep ocean, 6,000 feet down in complete darkness. Around you, somewhere in the darkness, is a 40-foot monster and its massive dinner plate-sized eye watching you and deciding if you're food. Often regarded as one of the tastiest of the shellfish, lobsters are also one of the most expensive. Historically, they were considered a food that only commoners ate due to their availability and poor quality. In fact, when their population was larger, they frequently washed up on shore, making them one of the easier foods to catch. But because of their slow growth rate, their population has dwindled to just a fraction of what it was due to overfishing. They're also a bit more difficult to catch in large numbers, and difficult to store to be kept safe to eat by modern food standards. There are some modern mass farming methods to catch them, like trawling with nets or using lobster pots, but there are certain lobsters that are still caught commercially, the old-fashioned way. Certain lobsters, like slipper lobsters, prefer the crevices of caves and reefs, and so they are frequently caught by scuba divers with hand nets. The scuba divers will literally walk along the bottom of the ocean and then find and catch the lobsters by hand. On June 11th, 56-year-old lobster diver Michael Packard was fishing off of Provincetown, Massachusetts. His first dive of the day had gone poorly and yielded almost nothing, so at around 8 a.m. he dropped into the water once again to a depth of about 15 meters. But then just before he touched down on the ocean floor he felt a massive push from behind, almost like he'd been hit by a truck, and then everything went dark. For a split second Michael thought he'd been attacked by a great white shark because nothing else could possibly be that big. Then he felt around and realized that it was all soft muscle around him. That's when he realized he was in a whale's mouth. The whale had scooped him up from behind and was now trying to swallow him whole. Thankfully, he still had all of his scuba gear on, so he waited anxiously, not knowing whether he'd soon be crushed or if the whale would realize he wasn't food. About 30 or 40 seconds later, he felt the whale shake side to side, and then he started to see light. Then he saw bubbles all around him as the whale surfaced and spat him out. The last he saw of it was its massive tail dipping back below the water's surface. Although he was shaken, he was thankful to be alive. Also on the surface was the boat and crew that Michael was with, who watched this entire thing unfold. According to the captain of the boat, Michael came flying out of the water feet first and then landed on his back. They quickly pulled him on board, thinking he had broken his leg, and then rushed him to the hospital where they determined that it was only a dislocated knee. Other than that, he just had some bruising on his legs and thankfully had no signs of any air embolism from surfacing so quickly. He was released by the end of the day and returned to diving the following week. The whale that swallowed him was a humpback whale, which can grow to be as much as 50 feet long and 36 tons and don't eat humans. In fact, this behavior is basically unheard of. It's thought that the whale mistook the bubbles from his scuba gear as a school of fish and then opened its massive mouth like it normally does to use as a net. Thankfully, once it realized he wasn't a fish, it spit him back out again. In October of 2003, 26-year-olds Tina and Gabe had a wonderful wedding in Birmingham, Alabama. For their honeymoon, they wanted to do something adventurous, and so just 2 days after they were married, they hopped on a plane to Sydney, Australia to do some sightseeing. After spending a few days in Sydney, they left for the West Coast, where they planned to go on an excursion with a diving company to dive the historic shipwreck, the Yam Gala. On the 21st of October at 10 p.m., they arrived at the coast and boarded the boat that would make an overnight sail to the dive site. By the time it arrived at 2 a.m., the couple was asleep in their bunk, resting for the dive the following day. Then at 9 a.m. on the 22nd, Tina and Gabe joined the crew and the other divers on deck to be briefed about the equipment and the dive route. Tina and Gabe both brought everything they needed except for a set of air tanks that they would get from the excursion crew members. Once they were suited up and ready to go, they hopped into the water with a group of 4 other divers to explore the wreck. But just a few minutes later, they swam back up to the boat because Gabe's dive computer didn't seem to be working right. He ended up pulling the battery out and repositioning it. At which point it started working properly, and then the two of them jumped back in the water. The shipwreck they were exploring was an early 1900s passenger boat that sank off the coast and has since become a popular diving location. It's located near a section of the Great Barrier Reef and rests between 30 and 16 meters deep. This means that it's accessible by recreational divers. After entering the water, the couple planned to travel down the anchor line, then swim across the upper section of the wreck, and then ascend a second anchor line back up to the surface. But moments later, Gabe was back up at the surface, and this time, Tina wasn't with him. Gabe called out, asking for help retrieving her, and then one of the crew members jumped into the water to go find her. The crew member eventually found her lying lifelessly along the ocean floor and brought her back up to the boat. Unfortunately, despite trying to resuscitate her for 45 minutes, Tina couldn't be revived. This was obviously an incredibly tragic incident for a couple on their honeymoon. One second they were in love and ready to spend the rest of their lives together, and the next moment they were torn apart. However, upon beginning an investigation into the incident, things started to not add up. First, everyone on the boat was an experienced diver except for Tina. This dive is also known as a red dive because of its difficulty because of the strong current in the water in that area. Red dives are typically only recommended for advanced divers. Investigators questioned Gabe about why they chose to go on this dive and why they had turned down an orientation session or why they had turned down having a guide with them during their trip. That in itself isn't necessarily suspicious. People are overconfident in their abilities all the time. What was suspicious was Gabe's behavior and his retelling of the events. According to Gabe, the couple realized how difficult the dive was almost immediately upon entering the water. The current was really strong, so Tina signaled to him that she wanted to go back up. Gabe signaled to her to inflate her buoyancy device so that they could float back up, but when she tried to inflate it, nothing happened. Instead, Gabe claims to have grabbed a hold of her and started pulling her, but while doing so she accidentally knocked the mask off his face. He let go of her to fix it, and then when he could see again, Tina was 10 feet below him and sinking fast. And although she had her arms up trying to reach for him, Gabe couldn't get to her in time. It was at that point that he surfaced and called for help. The problem with this explanation is that not only was Gabe open water certified, but he was also an advanced diver, a rescue diver, and a specialty diver. This meant that it was weird that he wouldn't have been able to help her. He could have helped her inflate her buoyancy device. Or, after she sank, gone to give her air. What was also suspicious was that there were inconsistencies in each of his retellings of the event. During the investigation, he was also asked to have his dive computer returned to him. This wrist-worn device tracks all the events of a dive, like depth and time, and when police refused to return the dive computer, Gabe got upset and argued with police and even asked for it a second time. It was later revealed that the account he gave seemed to contradict what the dive computer showed. His story also contradicted what other divers had seen that day. Upon examining Tina's body and equipment, the evidence was even more suspicious. It was determined that Tina had drowned, but her regular was still in her mouth. Her tank was also still completely filled with air, and her equipment had no faults. Based on all of this information, this is the sequence of events a prosecution would later put forward. After re-entering the water the second time, the couple was seen hugging in the water. It was actually described as though Gabe was bear-hugging Tina. It's thought that during the hug, Gabe turned off her air valve and then held her until she suffocated. After that, he turned her air back on and then watched as she sank to the bottom. His dive computer seemed to corroborate this because the ascent that you'd expect would be much quicker than what was actually recorded, indicating that he might have lingered to ensure that she was actually dead. In addition to this, supposedly his dive computer had beeped before changing the battery. This wouldn't have happened had it not been functioning properly. It's thought that he had used this as an excuse to get Tina away from the other divers. The final piece of the story was a motive. Why would a newlywed husband have any reason to get rid of his wife? Why not just not marry her? Well, apparently according to Tina's father, Tina had mentioned to him that shortly before getting married, Gabe had asked her to increase her company's life insurance policy to the maximum amount and make him the sole beneficiary. In Australia, Gabe pled guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 12 months and a suspended 4-year sentence. After serving that amount, he was deported to the US, where he was arrested and charged again. However, this case was thrown out by the judge due to a lack of evidence. It was also revealed that the prosecution's own witness, who was a diving expert, had changed his mind in the later stages of the proceedings. New evidence came to light that Gabe's experience was less than what everyone initially thought. The course that Gabe had taken was half the length of a regular course, and he had no rescue experience and almost no open water experience. The diving expert would later say that he had no hope of being competent. He could barely save himself that day, let alone his wife. In fact, Gabe had even required some help getting his equipment on the day of their dive. In the court proceedings, the judge would also block Tina's father from providing testimony about Gabe's supposed request to increase her life insurance policy. After his acquittal, a couple years later, in 2007, Tina's family noticed that the flowers and gifts they left on Tina's grave kept getting vandalized or disappearing entirely. This kept happening, even after chaining the items to the ground. After telling police about these incidents, police recorded a video of Gabe removing the items with bolt cutters and throwing them in the garbage. It was so bad that he was later given a court order to stay away from her grave. But in recent years and re-examining the case, it seems as though many diving experts are of the opinion that this was simply a case of individuals who should not have been in the position they were in, and their lack of experience ultimately led to a preventable death. However, Gabe's later actions are interesting to say the least. Born in Florida in 1981, Nicholas Mavely spent most of his adult life in Brooklyn, New York, where he worked as a prop technician in film and television. Some of the more notable pieces he worked on included Gossip Girl and The Chappelle Show. He also had some aspirations of becoming a writer and an actor, and even starred in the independent film Exist. He was also a great athlete and a bit of a daredevil. This would eventually lead him to take up freediving, and then in 2012 he started freediving competitively. Shortly following his decision to compete, he got very good very quickly. Within a year's time, he won the Deja Blue competition in the Cayman Islands. Then he won it the following year in 2013 as well and wanted to place third at the Caribbean Cup. Then after that,